Morning, everybody. I guess we will get started. This is our workshop on the Form 323 data. This is designed to empower people in the research community to use our data for studies, to merge it with other data from other sources, and basically make a broad variety of uses of the data. It's fairly simple to do once you understand the structure using fairly simple tools, and we'll go through all of that today. I guess let's start by introducing ourselves. My name is Jake Ream. I'm an attorney in the Media Bureau's Industry Analysis Division. Before I went to law school, I worked in database development, so I got a little bit of a flavor for working with data. And then I went into private practice after law school, and I have filed more of these Form 323s than I care to admit. And then after private practice, I came here where I've looked at more of these 323s than I care to admit, and sort of gotten more into the data structure and understanding how the information is stored and how it's manipulated. So that is my background, and hope I can help you guys learn how to work with our data.
Good morning. My name is Jessica Campbell. I'm also an attorney in the Media Bureau's Industry Analysis Division. I don't have the background in programming that Jake has, but I am familiar with the Form 323, and I assist our filers when it comes to the filing of the form. Our next filing period does open October 1 and close December 2nd. So I will be interacting a lot with the practitioners and the licensees as they make their way through the form. So thank you for joining us this morning.
Hi, my name is Eugene Kiselev. I'm an economist in the Media Bureau's Industry Analysis Division. And so I actually had limited exposure to our ownership data prior to a few months ago, and also limited exposure to SQL, but I've always worked with data, and I thought this was a great opportunity to sort of learn about the structure of our ownership data and learn how to use some database management tools, and then be able to share that knowledge and experience with you guys at this workshop. So hope I can do that.
Hey, good morning. My name is John Gabrish, and I'm a senior engineer in the Media Bureau. And in my dozen years or so here, I've been working with a wide variety of data sources and simulations and databases and everything within the FCC and from without. So I'm happy to be here and welcome everybody this morning.
Okay, we have some other FCC people here that I'd like to introduce. Hillary DeNegro is here. She's the chief of the Media Bureau's Industry Analysis Division and an attorney. Brendan Holland, deputy chief of the Industry Analysis Division, also an attorney. Susan Singer is chief economist of the Media Bureau, an associate bureau chief. Andy Wise is an economist and assistant chief of Industry Analysis Division, Media Bureau. Got Chris Clark behind there. He's an attorney who's been helping us with 323 for the Industry Analysis Division. Jalissa, your title, so I get it right. Assistant Chief Media Bureau is here as well. We've got Allison Neplock back there and Jeff Newman. And they're very well suited to provide technical assistance if things go awry for you in the workshop. So just put your hand up and we'll get you connected. Okay, I guess we're ready to start.
Okay.
Yep. Yep. So as background, the Media Bureau collects lots of data from broadcast stations. Ownership information, which is our focus today. We collect information about transactions, technical operations. There's a wide variety of stuff, and it's available on our website, and we'll show you where that is a little later. Most of this information we collect via filings that broadcasters submit to us, and those are submitted electronically. And the information from those filings gets dumped into a database that is publicly available and usable by anybody who wants to use it. Today we're going to focus on the broadcast ownership report filings, and Jessica's going to go through those.
Okay, Good morning. We're here today to discuss accessing and using the Commission's commercial broadcast station ownership data. But before we dive in, I want to take a step back and give you just a very brief overview of the form through which we collect that data. That's the Form 323. The 323 collects ownership data from licensees and those with what we call an attributable interest in a commercial broadcast station. Our commission rules define what interests are attributable, and these help us determine who has an ownership interest in a station, a broadcast station. So, for example, officers, directors, and those with a greater than 5% voting interest in a licensee are among those that we consider to have an ownership interest. Next slide. Now, generally, we have two types of Form 323. We have a biennial and a non-biennial version. The biennial 323 is required to be filed by licensees of AM, FM, full-power TV, Class A, and LPTV stations, and each entity with an attributable or ownership interest in that licensee. As the name suggests, these reports are filed every other year in odd-numbered years. And the information provided on those reports must reflect the ownership structure of those entities as of October 1 of that filing year. Again, these reports are filed every odd-numbered year. Filing period opens October 1, and they're typically due early December. The purpose of this report is to capture the broadcast station interests on a uniform date, that's October 1. And this is necessary for the study of broadcast station ownership over time. Again, it's capturing, what ownership interests look like on one particular date for all those commercial broadcast stations. It's important for our discussion today. The individuals reported on these forms, their race, gender, and ethnicity are reported on the biennial 323. We also have what's called a non-biennial 323. It's filed by virtually the same universe of stations, except Class A and LPTV do not file. The non-biennial version of the form is filed in connection with certain events, like the assignment or transfer of control of a broadcast station, a grant of an initial construction permit, or the filing of an initial licensee application. And the purpose here is to capture what the ownership structure of that station or entity looks like at the triggering event. So on these reports, while individuals are included on the reports, the race, gender, and ethnicity are not reported. Again, so it's only the biennial 323 that we capture the race, gender, and ethnicity of individuals reported on the filing. Again, this was intended to be a very brief, high-level introduction to the form itself, but does anyone have any questions? Okay. If not, I'll turn this back over to Jake. Jake is going to walk us through our analysis of the reports, of the actual printed reports.
We are going to actually go through some ownership filings by hand a little bit later, but I wanted to set some background about how they work so that we can understand them more easily. An important thing to know is that in general, stations do not file just one ownership report. A bunch of ownership reports are filed for a station, and those reports taken together help us capture how a station is owned. And this chart sort of explains how that works. So let's look at the bottom level, the licensee. That licensee will hold the licenses for, one or two or more broadcast stations. It files a report that discloses the station licenses that it holds, and then discloses the people and entities that hold direct interests in the licensee. So the licensee's report here would say, I'm the licensee, here's my name, Parent 1 has an ownership interest in me, and perhaps that these other people have some ownership interests in me. People do not file ownership reports in general, but entities do. So what does Parent 1 do? Parent 1 submits an ownership report that says, I have an ownership interest in the licensee, and here's how I'm owned. Here's my parent entity and the people who have ownership interest in me, perhaps. And parent 2 does the same thing up the chain, and you chain those reports together, and you can figure out the ownership structure of a licensee and who has what sort of interest in it. In many cases, you will eventually end up at people. Sometimes you won't. For example, if you get to the top of a chain, you may end up with people who are officers and directors, but you may not end up with anybody who has a voting interest that's reportable because we've got the 5% cutoff, and it may just be that there are no 5% or greater shareholders of that entity. But if there are people who have attributable interest to disclose, they will be disclosed on a report, and based on what report they're disclosed on, you can figure out how that interest relates to the licensee. The one exception to this idea that people do not file ownership reports is that sole proprietor licensees do. So if the licensee of a station is really a person who's operating as a sole proprietorship, that will file a report that basically says, I'm a sole proprietorship and here's my information. Does that make sense to everybody? So at the end of the day, this means that for many licensees, the ownership structure is complicated, and there'll be a lot of reports to analyze. But it's just really not, for many reasons, it's not possible to sort of get all this information to come in on one form. It makes much more sense to have the entities file their report. So this is how it comes in. Let's go to the next slide. This is sort of a quick and dirty way to think about voting interests. When you're thinking about ownership percentages, again, based on what Jessica said, thinking about voting percentages. Voting interest is really what we capture here. Voting interests in a licensee are aggregated and multiplied through, and this sort of complicated example sort of shows how that works. So if you look at the licensee, you've got parent 1. Parent 1 has a 40% direct voting interest in the licensee. Parent 2 has a 30% direct voting interest. Parent 3 is a little trickier. Parent 3 has a 30% voting interest in the licensee, but also has an interest in parent 1, 25% interest. And you take account for both of those when you figure out ultimately what parent 3's voting interest in the licensee is. Parent 4, their interest is indirect. They have a quarter of that 40% interest, and parent 5 has half of that 40% interest from parent 1, but also all of parent 2's 30% interest. So take parent 5, and they have 50% indirect interest. And then works the same way with people. Person A has all of parent 3's votes, but half of parent 4's votes, and you would take those together. And person B has all of parent 5's votes and half of parent 4's votes, so that ends up being with person A having 45 and person B having 55, if my math is correct, which I think it is. So you need to think and aggregate the ownership interest together based on sort of the chain of ownership that's filed. And we're going to go through an ownership report example and explain that in more detail. But does that generally make sense, or are there questions? Yes. Voting percentages are the same on both reports. Okay. I'm going to go through a very simple report analysis. If you look at your handouts, you have clipped together 3 ownership reports that have funny colored highlighting on them. And we're going to go through these reports in some detail. There's only 3 of them. It'll be fairly quick. Let's get the one with the pink highlighting on it at the top. Look at that one. I want to point out to you certain things on the form where various pieces of data are, and then we'll go through the information we're going to gather. I guess to begin with, let's focus on the upper right where it says for commission use only and it has a file number. I want to explain how that file number works. It starts with BOA. That is a prefix, file prefix that lets you know it's a biennial report. It oddly means biennial ownership annual, and the reason is because this used to be an annual requirement and then was later made into a biennial requirement, but the prefix has stuck. You will sometimes see biennial ownership reports that have the prefix BOR. That's another prefix that can be for a biennial report. For non-biennial reports, the prefix is BON or BOS. So that is a good way to, both when looking at reports on paper and later when you're analyzing them electronically, to distinguish between a biennial filing and a non-biennial filing. The last part of the file number, that string of numbers, probably can figure it out, but it's a date stamp. So you got the year, the month, and the date. So this was filed on December 18th, 2013. And the ECS at the end, these are just three-letter codes that are given out sequentially to give file stamps. So the first filing on a day is AAA, and then you get AAB, AAC. So that's just the manner that they use to ultimately give it a unique number. Okay, so Section 1, Question 1 is the name of the respondent. Now, in an ownership report, there's two concepts. The respondent is the entity that is filing the report. So it's the licensee or their parent or the parent above that. And then there is the licensee. So on a biennial report for a licensee entity, the respondent and the licensee are the same. But a parent report, the respondent would be the parent entity that's filing it, and it would list the licensee for which it's filing the report. And that's really the best way to think about it. The respondent information tells you who is filing the report. The licensee information basically tells you why they're filing the report, what licensee they have an interest in. If you go down to item 3, nature of respondent, it has licensee, permittee, or entity with an attributable interest. I know this is the licensee report because licensee is checked. So as we go through the analysis, this is the report on the bottom. Next question, it says it's current as of October 1, 2013, and it notes that it's a biennial report. When I mentioned that you could have a BOR prefix, that would be if it was filed as a validation and resubmission of a previous report. That's when it gets a BOR. And that's a situation where somebody has to file a biennial report and they know it was the same as last time, so they basically make a copy of it, resubmit it again, and say nothing's changed, and we give that a different file number. So if you move along to item 7, that's where we list the licensee and the stations that they have. And number 8 just says what kind of entity you are that's filing. Here the entity is LLC, which is not one of our standard categories, so you say other there. So all of that information is sort of important to the analysis and the examples we're going to go through today. Some of the remaining information is not, and so I'm just going to go through it very quickly. The next question asks about contracts that you have to file with the Commission. There is a rule that says that certain kinds of contracts and agreements have to be filed with the Commission. This is just listing them. And this entity had a lot of them, so we've got to go a couple pages on. Question 2 just asks about stock capitalization. That's not particularly relevant to our analysis. Here it's not applicable because it's not an entity that has stock. It's not really very important to our analysis. 3A, which is the next question, is important to our analysis. And this is where the filer discloses the people and entity that have an attributable interest in the filer. The first record is always for the entity, the respondent, the entities that files the report, and that's just so we know where we're starting from. And then the remaining copies, which we'll go through in a little more detail later, but they go on for the next few pages, those provide the information about the people and entities that have an attributable interest in the respondent. And that really is most of what's important on this form for us. Just real quickly, the rest of the form, question B, which is at the end of that big set of tables for question 2A, that just they're certifying that they've told us about everybody who has an ownership interest. Question C is about ownership of other broadcast stations or newspaper entities by this licensee, which we're not going to get into today. D asks about whether there are individuals listed on the report that are related to each other or married to each other, which can raise attribution issues, but they should also be reported anyway. But we're not really getting into that today. Question E is about an attribution exemption. In certain cases, you can a licensee or a parent entity can claim that certain officers or directors are not really owners of their stations because they have duties that aren't related to what the broadcaster does. This is sort of common when a station is owned by an entity that's not primarily a broadcaster. I did work on the outside where a station was owned by an insurance company, and the broadcast station was like 0.5% of its annual revenue. So there were a few people who knew what was going on. Most of the people at the company, not only were they not attributable, they would be shocked to know they had broadcast stations. So, and then question 5 there, licensees will submit an organizational chart on Biennial Form 323 just to help, so you can look at it and help you figure out the structure of the reports. We're going to skip that for now. That's going to make an appearance later, but we're not going to talk about that now. And if you go to the next page, you'll see that link that's in red. That is a link to the organizational chart, so you could pick that up. And spreadsheet at the end is where the filers disclose other broadcast interests. That's another thing we're going to revisit later. We're not going to do that now, but basically, if you're going to report other broadcast interests, you can either enter those information into the form, or you can provide an exhibit. In this case, the filer provided an exhibit. So that's how the report works generally. Now let's start from the beginning and chain this through. So if you can click through to me. The first thing you'd note is the bottom entity that's filing the report. And this is the colors are supposed to match here. That's why all the funny colored highlighting is there. So we're on the first report that we know is for the licensee, the one we just looked at, Sagamore Hill of Minnesota Licenses LLC. And the stations that's licensed to it is KXLT, Rochester, Minnesota, which is in yellow. Getting ahead of me. Then we go to section 3A, question 3A, which is 4 pages on. You see where the first record is for the licensee highlighted in pink. Again, I mentioned that in this section where the ownership interests are disclosed, the filer is always first, and that just lets you know where you are on the chain. If you go to the next page, though, copy 2 discloses an entity called Sagamore Hill of Minnesota LLC, which is highlighted in blue. And if you go down the record for that interest holder, you see they say they're an interest holder, not the respondent. And they classify themselves on the next page at the top as an entity with an attributable interest. And they're an LLC member and an owner, which makes sense because that's the interest, the entity they have an interest in. And they provide their FRN, FCC registration number. And I should have talked about this earlier, so let me introduce the concept right now. Every entity or person that files an ownership report or is listed on an ownership report provides something called an FCC registration number. And that is a unique identifier for that person or individual. Sort of to get ahead of ourselves, that is what allows the data manipulation and the data use that we're going to talk about later to take place, because everybody who files is uniquely identified by an FCC registration number. So they get an FCC registration number for the commission, and they're supposed to use that same FCC registration number consistently through their reports, which means that that's a unique thing that you can look for in the data to get information about that person or individual. So, at the beginning of this report, Sagamore Hill of Minnesota Licenses LLC provided its FRN. It provided its FRN in Section 3A, and this is the FRN here for the blue entity, which is Sagamore Hill of Minnesota. And then if you move on, you've got an individual named Lewis Wall, who discloses himself as an officer and gives his FCC registration number. He doesn't have any of the votes, right? Because Sagamore Hill of Minnesota, if you look, they disclosed that they had 100% of the votes in the licensee. So Lewis Wall is an officer with 0% voting interest, and you see he has his gender, ethnicity, and race information there. And then the next record is Deborah Kane, who is also an officer with none of the votes, and you see that her race, gender, and ethnicity information is there as well. And so, based on this chart and what we've discussed, what do we need next? We need to look for what report? For the blue entity that has the 100% interest, right? So that's Sagamore Hill of Minnesota. And if you'll see, I have found that report for you, and that's next here. That's the filing that the file number at the top ends with DRJ, and it has the blue highlighting at the top. So that's the filing for Sagamore Hill of Minnesota, LLC. And it provides its FRN, FTC registration number there. That matches the FRN that it provided on the licensee's report as well. That's how the reports get chained together and how they reference each other. And again, it lists KXLT TV. And on the next page, it discloses that it has an interest in Sagamore Hill of Minnesota Licenses LLC, which was the licensee entity, and there's its FRN, and lists the station. So the first part, they're disclosing who they are that's filing, and then on the second page, question 7, they're explaining why they're filing. They're filing because they have an interest in this licensee and these stations. And there could be multiple stations per licensee. It just happens in this example, a licensee has one TV station. And then we move on to question 3A, which really starts on the next page. And this is going to be very familiar to you. The top of the third page, you got the respondent, Sagamore Hill of Minnesota, LLC, disclosing that it is the respondent and giving its FRN. And the next line on page 4, you have the entity in green, Sagamore Hill Midwest, LLC, which has provided its FRN and is provided at the bottom the information that it has all of the votes in Sagamore Hill of Minnesota. So at this point we know Sagamore Hill Midwest has 100% indirect voting interest in the licensee because it 100% votes the entity that 100% directly votes the licensee. And then if we move on, we'll see some familiar faces. Lewis Wall is disclosed as an other interest holder, as an officer. His FRN is given there. Again, that's the same FRN he's provided before. He has an officer with none of the votes, and Deborah Kane has an officer with none of the votes. So they sort of have the same relationship to this parent entity that they did to the licensee. And so now we know we need to look for the ownership report for Sagamore Hill Midwest, LLC.
Are there any questions?
Does this make sense? It looks complicated, but once you figure out how the reports are structured, it's fairly easy to cycle through them. So we have the third report. It's got the green highlighting on it. It ends with the file number DWC. This is the report for Sagamore Hill Midwest, LLC. It gives its FRN. Again, that matches the FRN provided on the other report. That's how you connect them. It discloses that its interest is in KXLT TV. And on the next page, it lists the licensee and the stations. So again, at the top, it's who's filing, and sort of the question 7 on the second page, why they're filing. Then we move on to the third page, which is the ownership information. And as before, this is probably getting boring now. The first record is for the respondent to let you know where you're starting. And then the next records are for the interest holder. And we see Lewis Wall again, disclosed as an other interest holder, a person with an interest holder. But he now is an officer and a member of the LLC. And he discloses that he has 100% of the votes. And then we have Deborah Kane, who is disclosed as an officer with 0% of the votes. So we know at the end of this that Sagamore Hill of Minnesota is 100% voted by the licenses entity, Sagamore Hill of Minnesota Licenses LLC. These names are all the same. It's confusing. 100% voted by Sagamore Hill of Minnesota LLC. That in turn is 100% voted by Sagamore Hill Midwest LLC, which is 100% voted by Lewis Wall, and so all the votes are there. Questions? I see puzzled look, so. feel free to ask questions. Well, if it is still confusing, it will become clear as we go through some more examples.
I mean, this is how we, again, put together the chain without the benefit of the codes and the queries and everything that Jake and Eugene will be walking through later.
Before 2009, when this data became electronically filed, it was electronically filed before, but a lot of information went in exhibits that weren't searchable. And so if you wanted to figure out how ownership worked, you really had to do this. You don't really have to do this anymore, but it's useful to do it so you understand how electronic analysis works, because it basically is electronically doing this. Okay. So I told you that the licensee discloses an ownership chart with his ownership report. It attaches one so that you can find out the ownership report, ownership for yourself. Here is the chart that they disclosed, and you'll see that what we just figured out is on there. Go to the next slide there. That's what we just figured out. But this also discloses a couple other interests, which is useful information to know. You can figure this out electronically as well, but the lesson here is that A, we got it right, and B, sometimes you will see ownership charts get uploaded that tell you more than they have to tell you. And the reason for that is simple if you think about it. If you're filing for a bunch of related entities, it's just easier to put together one chart that you can upload to all the relevant reports than to put together one chart that did one chain, one chart that did the other, one chart that did the other. So sometimes, very often in fact, these ownership charts will tell you the ownership structure of what you've looked at, but it'll also tell you a little more. Here, we know that Sagamore Hill Midwest entity has interests in 2 other stations, and we'll figure out how we could learn that another way a little bit later. And we're going to talk about electronic access to the Commission's data. I'll leave that to you. Thank you.
So now that we've changed through an ownership report, we can talk about where the electronic filings are actually housed, and not just the electronic filings, but the database and the data tables underlying these reports. And so we have in the Media Bureau, we have a database called CDBS, which has a public access website, which is very easy to get to. When I get to it, I usually just type in CDBS in Google, and it is literally the first link. Our initial plan was to actually take you through the website, but as luck would have it, we're undergoing some server upgrades, and pretty much just for one day, which is today, the database is not available. But what we'll do is, we'll go through some screenshots of what it's going to look like, and we'll put the presentation up after the workshop today. And if you're interested in seeing where all this data is housed and looking through some ownership reports, you can actually do that by accessing the database or going to the public access website tomorrow, and it should be up.
And we provided the URL, so you should.
And yes, the URL is right at the top there. And so there are 2 sort of very important links here. It's the link that says search for ownership report information towards the middle, and then the one at the bottom that says download engineering data. Download engineering data is a little deceptive. It's not just engineering data. That's actually all CDBS public access data files. And I'll get to that in a second. But let's start with the search ownership report. So if you click that,
it's actually application.
Information.
This is the application.
So if you click that, and you'll get to something that looks like this, which is the application search. This is basically a query screen. It's sort of a front end of some of the sort of SQL queries that we're going to be going into later. And this allows you to basically search for some of these ownership reports by category. You can search by the call sign, the sort of the facility ID of the station. And so I guess a lot of people are familiar with the station call sign, WNYW, whatever it may be. But the FCC sort of identifies stations by what we call a facility ID, which is just an integer. It can be from 2 digits all the way to 6, I believe, 6 or 7.
And that, again, going back to this idea of unique identification being important for data integrity, call signs change all the time, especially in TV, they change some. Radio, they change quite a bit. So whatever was WXYZ one day may be WWWW the next day. And so if you tried to track ownership over time based on call sign, you would have a very difficult time because those are not capable of uniquely identifying stations over time. FAC IDs are assigned to stations as soon as they're built, and they stay the same no matter what the call sign changes happen in the interim. So that's why we use the facility ID, and that's why when you see us manipulating some of this data later, you'll see that we rely on the facility ID as a unique identifier because the call sign is not useful for that purpose. Now, at any given time, you can figure out a call sign from a facility ID, and we'll show you how to do that. But if you're really trying to get at the data, manipulate it, understand it, link it, search it, facility ID is how you want to go.
Right. And so, you can do a search based on the criteria you're interested in, click Submit Application Search, and the next thing that would pop up is actually the list of ownership reports. And you can click on them, and they will look exactly like, the printed out versions of those reports that we had just gone through with you guys. So that's how do you search for the actual electronically filed reports. If you're interested in the data tables underlying those reports, you would click on, you would go back to the main prompt here and click Download Engineering Data, and that would take you to a screen that looks like this. And so here, it's basically all of CDBS data. We've highlighted sort of the ownership tables, and a little bit from now we'll actually go over the direct linkage between the ownership report and sort of the ownership tables as they're presented in the database. But everything is here in a zip file for you. There's helpful documentation. There's a README. There's sort of a description of what the tables contain, the variable names, the type of variables they are, string, integer, date, time variable. Information about its release notes, and this data is updated daily. So whenever you get to it, that is sort of the most recent data when you access the public access site. And so we provide this data to you when you unzip it. You'll see that the extension is .dat, and that's sort of a generic data file. You can actually open it in a notepad in a text document. You can decide to open it in Excel. And the reason we've done that is because, putting it in a generic format means it's easy for people to work with in whatever program they're comfortable. So, one interesting thing about SQL is that sort of the front end for for the query language varies. It can be what we'll be using later, which is MySQL. It could be Oracle. It could be Access. And they all save their databases in a different file format. And then if you're interested in only using one or two tables, you maybe want to manipulate them in Stata if you're more comfortable, or SAS if you're more comfortable. So again, the benefit of a generic data file is you can import it with relative ease into any of these programs and manipulate it and work with it to your heart's desire. So that's the reason we have it up here. And so what we've done for the purposes of the workshop is done some of the upfront work of actually creating these local MySQL databases, which are basically just these zip files. And we can show you the scripts that we'll get to the scripts that we ran in order to do that, and they're actually very simple.
Back up to this slide. I want to walk through it.
Sure.
Yep. So take a big picture of what he just said. We collect a lot of broadcast ownership data. And researchers want to do a lot of things with it. And we don't know necessarily what they want to do with it. They could want to do a whole lot of things. And what we want to do is empower them to do that. So we went through CDBS Public Access, and that's a great tool to use if you want to pull up paper filings. For instance, answering a quick question that you have, who's the licensee of this station? What did they file ownership reports? What do their last ownership reports say? That's great. But if you really want to work with the data, if you're the kind of person who says, I want to study this data, I want to do a study of this data, you need to have the data, and you need to be able to work with it in a wide variety of ways. What we've done, and this is very standard way of doing it, is as he said, we provided the data files in really the most generic format possible. And that means that you or anybody can go get them at any time and do whatever they want with them, with whatever tools they're comfortable with. For those of you with background, you've probably gathered this. The data is in a relational database, which is, again, very standard for putting big data out there. It's how you put big data out there for people who know what to do with data. It allows research to study and use the data in powerful ways. And he talked about all the tools that you can use to do it. You can search it, manipulate it, cross-reference it, merge it with other data. We're going to talk about doing all of this. And again, standard database tools, whatever you're comfortable with, you should be able to make a go of it with this data. And interested parties can download that data at any time for study analysis, which means that once all the biennial filings are in, off to the races to study it at any time. And that's updated sort of every day. And it's good at this point to introduce some distinctions that'll be helpful. When we talk about the broadcast ownership data in this workshop, we're going to be talking about the data tables. That is the broadcast ownership data. And that's what we search, aggregate, cross-reference. There's also analysis of the data, which is what you all do. And that's what we're sort of empowering you to do. We have done an analysis. Every year we do an analysis, or every 2 years, I guess, biennial, we do an analysis of the data that's called the 323 ownership report. We put it out every year. It does a certain type of analysis of the data. It does several analyses of the data that are explained in it, and it provides some tables that are created as the basis of our analysis. But it is an analysis of the data, and it's analysis that we think is interesting. It is analysis that we think some people in the research community will find interesting, but it is an analysis of the data, not the data itself. The data itself is the tables, and so that's a good distinction to keep in mind. Although we will see that broadcast ownership report, we actually, there's a table in that we've produced that actually is useful for further research, and we'll do that a little later in the workshop.
So are there any questions about, yes?
I'm looking at the past 323 ownership reports, especially in the categories other than full power broadcast stations. There are a lot of stations that this is for at all. So is that still a problem? Because if you don't, no matter how good your tools are, if you don't have enough of the data, it's actually from all the stations. I don't know how much good you can do.
We are aware that filing rates are not what we want them to be. They're really good for full power TV. We do have some issues with filing rates, and we know that's an issue, and we're working to address it. And just as a big issue that I should have raised, this reminds me of a big issue I just should have raised earlier on, which is that we do have some open proceedings addressing 4323, and some of you are probably aware of them, and they're open proceedings, and we can't really discuss them here, and that's not the purpose of what we're doing here. But to answer your question, yes, we want the filing rates to be better, and we're working to make that happen.
Yeah, and one of the things that we're aiming to do is we're hosting, of course, a brown bag on September 22nd, and we'll be here. If anyone in this room is a filer or knows some filers, I encourage you to come, or watch us online. We're going to be walking through, how to file a Form 323. This event is geared toward both novices and veteran filers. So we do try to increase our publicity of both the filing period, and of course we're here to help, especially our more beginner newbie filers, help them walk through the process. And of course we have our Form 323 webpage. It's probably much easier to find by Google. And maybe when the servers are really fully back up, we post a lot of information there, both the frequently asked questions, top 10 filing errors we list, and of course there's a number of ways for new filers to get a hold of us if they do have any questions. So again, I encourage you to tell your friends to check out that webpage, and again, check out our event on September 22nd. And we really want to lower the barrier to filing, so again we can capture all those non-filers and show them that it's we're here to help.
And also, that will address sort of common mistakes that some people make submitting their filings and how to fix them. And that's the goal of that, is to get our data better. We're actually running a little bit ahead of schedule. Do we want to do a break now? I think that makes sense because the next session may run a little longer.
Sure. And if anyone's still having some trouble setting up then we'll come around and be happy to help you guys set up and get ready for the next part.
Yep. So when we come back here in 15 minutes, looks like we're about a little bit ahead of schedule.
Yeah, I'm good to go for a while. I think the next time I'll hand it off to you is when, if you want to talk about the data structure of the ownership tables and how that relates specifically to the reports, like what the questions
Well, I want you to do yours, explain. The spiel I'm going to give is that we're going to build up from simple to complicated here.
Yeah, and then when specifically, let me think. Specifically like this slide right here, I was thinking this is where you talk about not just the relational structure of the ownership tables, but also how that, don't you want to discuss a little bit?
I'll have given this chart before I go into this chart goes before this.
Which one goes first?
So in other words, you're going to do the non-broadcast stuff.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to say, I'm going to introduce that with we're doing the simple stuff earlier.
Yeah.
And then do that. And then I say, no, we want to do ownership. What does ownership look like? And then I'm going to bring out this chart and talk about it.
Yes.
And then we'll go here.
Right, in the context of talking about this chart, yeah, you'll talk about what the questions are. All right, perfect.
Great.
That sounds good.
And then focus. These are
The main three ones there. Right.
I don't want to get bogged down in that. They don't want me to either. So I guess while Allison works on that, we'll just go ahead and continue. We also.
Yeah. Everyone ready? Okay.
So this workshop is structured to build from sort of the simple to the more complicated, obviously. And so while our goal here, for the most part, is to get into our ownership data and how to manipulate and use that, we're going to actually run through a few examples here that involve querying our non-broadcast ownership data, other broadcast data, just because it's a good way of showing how tables relate to each other, how queries get constructed, etc. We think those few examples will be helpful, and we'll go through them in a lot of detail and answer questions. And then we're going to move on to ownership examples, which I think will be easier to digest once we've gotten those few other examples together. Okay,
Yep.
It's all you.
All right, on to the fun stuff, the SQL. So as Jake mentioned, we'll start with some very simple examples that'll give you an idea of what a relational database is, how we can join two simple tables on an identifier or in a linkage between identifiers. And to start off, we're going to go into the MySQL workbench. And so this is hopefully you all have this installed now, and you're looking at what I'm looking at right up on the screen. And so this is sort of the front end for MySQL, and in here you can create scripts, you can write scripts, you can create new databases, open tables, and so part of the instructions that we gave you prior to the workshop was basically to create the local database that we'll be working with, and that local database or the scripts that are involved in doing so are sort of these three that I'm tabbing between right now. This is the table create script, which is very simple. It says create schema form 323. Schema is just a synonym for database, and so that's the database we're going to be working with. And not to go into too much detail, but it's got a bunch of create table commands, and in each one of these it says, what is the name of the variable that I'm creating, what type of variable is it, and is it going to be, are we allowing it to contain null values or not?
And these match the structure of the data tables within CDBS that hold the information, which for the ones that we're going to do in examples we'll go through in detail. But basically this is basically saying create a table in my database that matches the structure of what I'm going to bring in. The structure of the data you're going to bring in is explained in that engineering document that we referred to you earlier that explains how each table is laid out.
Exactly. And so, for example, the first thing it does is it creates this table called ownership group, and this is actually one of the ownership tables. And then in the data load script, let's find ownership. Here it is right here. It's going to say load the data from the table ownership group or from the data table ownership group.dat, which you downloaded as part of that data within that data repository.
That's the publicly available data.
That's the publicly available data file. That's right on CDBS and also now available in that additional repository we made for you. And you basically load it into the table that we had just created. And then you specify the names of all of the fields. And you do a little bit of extra work for the date to make sure the date is in a correct format. And then it basically loads that table in. This is a script that we created to load in some external data, some census data that we added into the data repository and we'll be going into sort of a little bit later. And so, it took maybe 5-10 minutes, and we created this local database that consisted of sort of the following tables. You can see as I'm going through them, there's about 10 or 12 tables. Each of them are fairly large. Some are smaller than others, but now you basically have a local database in a relational format because it's defined by these identifiers, and you can fool around with it. And so
we'll explain all these tables, what they are, as we go through the examples. So don't worry that you don't know what those data tables are yet. You will.
Right. And so I'll pull up a relational chart in just a second when we get to the first query example. But before I do so, whenever you work in MySQL, you want to make sure that you're working with a particular database. So as part of the installation, it also installed this database called Test, World, Sakila. And so if you right-click on one of them and say Set as Default, you see how it becomes bold. It's bolded. That means that's sort of the current database that you're on. And if you're trying to run a query that references certain tables in a different database, while you're currently selected to this one, it's not going to work. It'll tell you I don't understand what database we're in. So the first thing you have to do is you have to say use the database that you want, which in this case is Form 323. And by the way, this little yellow lightning bolt that my mouse is hovering over is the run button, essentially. It's the execute button. If you aren't selecting a particular line of code or lines of code, it will execute the whole thing. If you highlight a particular line, then that's the line it's going to execute. And so you say this, use Form 323, and you can see automatically that now Form 323 is the bolded database, and that's the one we're on.
And to back up, MySQL is a SQL tool that's out there. There's other tools that you can use to do SQL, and they'll all function differently, but these are sort of specific instructions about how to use this particular front end for SQL. Some of you will use Access, some of you may use Oracle. The SQL is pretty much the same, the front end and how it works. And
right.
Just like different word processing programs work basically the same, but will have different menuing.
Exactly. So, some skills that we teach you here are going to be very transferable when it gets to the actual query language. Some are going to be less so if you're interested in using Access or Oracle as opposed to MySQL. So to very quickly go through the ones that may not have universal benefit, there's this set SQL safe updates to 0. That's something we want to run just to otherwise MySQL limits certain queries. It worries that you're deleting things you don't want to, or you're updating tables in a way that you don't want to, and so it says, hey, we're going to put you in safe mode as the default, and if you want to get out of safe mode, then that's what you have to do. And we're all
it tries to save you from yourself.
Exactly right. And so I think we're all smart enough to know what we're doing, so we're going to set the safe updates to 0. Alter table is actually a command you're going to use quite a bit in a variety of contexts. In the context that it currently is in, where it's called alter table, and then, for example, facility, and if you look down here, there's the facility table, so that's the table it's actually referencing when you say alter table. In this context, there's an add index command. And what that does is it just sort of indexes certain variables. For example, within the facility table, you can expand this out to go to columns, and here are all the variables in this table. And a variable of particular interest to us is the facility ID of the station. And so this command, it basically creates an indexer for facility ID. And the reason you want to do that is if you're ever running a query and it's going remarkably slow, and you're not sure why because it doesn't seem like you're asking it to do all that much, it may be because you're not indexing the variable you want to use. So whenever you use a variable, when you're searching by it or joining two tables by it, it's important to index the variable, which sort of just lets SQL know that, hey, this is going to be something that we're going to be looking at. It's easier for it to find it within the relational context of the tables. And so it's just sort of an indexing function that's useful. And I believe I've ran this before, but yep. The error code it gave me just said that it's a duplicate key, which means I've already indexed it.
To be clear, you don't often have to do that. It is helpful.
It's helpful.
Yep.
And again, this is sort of not universal. I believe Access doesn't have an indexing function, which could be to its detriment if it's, because this could speed up queries quite a bit in MySQL. So let's go to a very simple query, and I'm going to show you sort of the relational structure of the tables that we're going to use in constructing this query. And this is it right here. Let me see. Let me put
So
this in.
what the goal here is we want to look not at ownership report data, but at CDBS station data and figure out the full power stations that are licensed to Washington, D.C.
Exactly. So the simplest query, or one of the simplest queries you can think of. And so for this query, we're going to need for this and the next query, we're going to need the following tables. We're going to need the facility table, which is on the left there. And in particular, highlighted in green is the main identifier of a station within the facility table, which is its facility ID. And so, for example, let's say not only are we interested in stations licensed to Washington, but as part of the query, we want to pull out sort of the licensee for that particular station. This is actually going to be pulling out licensee outside of the ownership reports. Later, we'll show you how to do it using the ownership report tables. So there's a table called party, which has licensee information, but it doesn't have additional information that you might be interested, like racial categories and some of the other things we discussed that are limited in the non-biennial report filings. But for this example, it suffices. And so let's say we want to link this facility table to this party table. Well, party is uniquely defined by party ID, which you can see on the right there highlighted in red. Facility is uniquely identified by facility ID. There's a table that exists in CDBS that we've also pulled out for you called FAC_party. And that's something we call a crosswalk table. It's a table that can connect two other tables based on a linkage between the two unique identifiers in the individual tables. And in this case, for every facility ID in the fact party table, there's going to be an associated party ID because it knows, our database knows that, for this station, this is the ID of the licensee. And so this is how you connect those tables conceptually. You say, you connect facility to FAC party on the facility ID identifier. And then likewise, you connect FAC party to party on the party ID identifier. So it's sort of this very simple A to B, then B to C connection. This is your standard sort of relational data format for connecting two or three tables. And of course, you can extend this to multiple tables. In fact, every single table in CDBS can eventually be connected to any other table, even if they're very disparate. If it's ownership data and something like engineering data, which we'll actually show you a little bit later on. But there's usually, very simple steps that you can take to make these linkages.
Let me talk about what some of that data is, like these.
Yeah, sure. So, let's actually talk a little bit about what the data in the facility table is. What kind of data are we looking at? This is station-level data. And it's actually station-level data for all stations, all broadcast stations, not just full power. This includes low-power stations, Class A stations. When the work we're going to be doing is going to focus on the full power.
TV, yeah.
But this table does contain data on basically every broadcast station. And so it has sort of the city of license, which is this community city, the state. It has sort of the digital channel number, country. Let's see. The type of station that it is, which is again, it's usually is going to be DT, we're going to be working with stations that are going to be identified as DT for digital television, but it could be LP for low power, CA for Class A stations. The status of the station, whether it's licensed or not, or pending. Let's see.
So the key is that for each facility ID for a station, there's one row on the facility table, and that row, that record contains these various pieces of information about that station.
That's right.
And so the fields are fairly self-explanatory. They're actually fairly well named in terms of what they mean. Yep.
So now that we know sort of the data structure that we want to work with, let's do a very basic query. And one moment as I reconnect the screen. Shift. This one? Oh, yeah.
That one.
There we go. And that reconnects the screen.
There you go.
Perfect. And so, as we mentioned, we wanted to find all licensed full power stations in Washington, D.C. And so this is the most basic query and probably some of the most important query functions when it comes to working with SQL. The first line says select, and that's exactly what you would think it is. It selects the categories from the tables that you want. In this case, and the way it selects it is sort of a prefix-suffix approach, where the prefix in this case is going to be what table is it from, and the table is called facility. If you remember, we can see that right here. Here's the facility table. And by the way, to very quickly show you what this table looks like, you can actually go over here to the right, to the left, under tables, right-click it, and say select rows, and it'll open up another tab, and in that tab, it will actually write the query for you. You can write this yourself, of course, but in this case, because we're working in a front-end environment, certain things are very easy to do just like that. And it says select star from form 323, which is the database name, .facility. So when you're referencing a table, you reference it by prefix database, suffix table name. When you're referencing a specific variable, it's prefix table name, suffix variable name. And so here it is.
And select star is just being select everything.
Yes.
You're not
Star
specifying.
is the wild card.
Right, it's
That's
sort of
everything.
the catch-all, just every row, every column, so everything that's in the facility table. And here is the output. We limited it to 1,000 so it would run quicker, but actually this facility table has probably hundreds of thousands of observations. And so again, it's uniquely identified by the facility ID. Let me very quickly find where that row is. Here it is.
There it is, yeah.
So clicking on it sort of sorts it, and the reason that it only goes up to 1627 is because it selects the first 1,000, and this table is already automatically sorted by facility, so we're only going to get, from facility ID 43 to the facility ID 1600 or so.
But all the columns correspond to the fields that we laid out.
That we
there.
discussed. So, for example, the service type. By the way, I sort of didn't do this table enough justice. It's not actually just broadcast TV stations. This actually includes FM and AM radio. So you'll see the fax service type gives you an indication. FM, AM, DT, digital television. You'll probably see some additional ones. LD.
Low power, Class A, all there.
They're all there.
Yep.
And so these are all the fields that we discussed, and these are the fields that you see, right here on the left. And so that's what it looks like. And if we want to run a query, let me just close out. Yeah. If we want to run this query, we say select certain things that we're interested in. So, for example, let's say we want the call sign, the facility identifier, the service type to make sure we're pulling out what we think we're pulling out, which is broadcast full power television. And let's pull out, from the party table, the name of the licensee, and additionally the community of license and the city and state of license. So you say select all that stuff from, and this is interesting. So you say from facility, but if you notice in the select statement, we're selecting actually from two tables, not just facility, but also from the party table. But that's okay, because the very next line says we want to, or within this query, which it sort of runs all the lines essentially as one whole statement, you're going to join it to the party table, so it's not going to be confused. It understands that you're selecting party here, but eventually you're joining it to the relevant table, and it'll understand that you still want to pull that out. So that's the select statement. From, very simple, it's from facility. And this is the join statement. There's a few types of joins. There are inner joins, outer joins. An inner join essentially says, pull out everything that I want from, table facility where this identifier fact party, where the facility ID identifier in the table facility is equal to the facility ID identifier in our crosswalk table fact party.
So that's the link between the tables in that diagram.
Right, so that's A to B. So these first two lines right here are essentially going from the table to the left to the table to the middle.
Linking them on the facility ID.
Linking them on the green, the facility ID. But next, we want to get from A to C eventually, so we need to go from B to C, which is the next line of code. It links us from the fact party table to the party table, and it does so by saying, inner join to party, which is the table C basically in this example, on party.partyid equals factParty.partyid. So that's the linkage. That's exactly the linkage that we're looking at right here. FactParty.partyid linked to party ID. So this is the B to C step. And now we want some conditions because we're interested in pulling out this information specifically for Washington, D.C. and for licensed full power stations. And that is accomplished by using this where statement, which essentially says where the service type in the table facility is DT, and as we mentioned, that refers to digital television. And the community city is like Washington. And like, when you say, you can say equals Washington, D.C., but let's say you're not exactly sure what the data table has in it. You haven't worked with it before. Maybe it's in capitalized, or maybe there's a space and there's a period between D and C. So if you say like Washington and you surround it with these percent signs, that's sort of a wild card that tells you whenever you see Washington in the city, pull that out. And in conjunction with saying that the state is equal to D.C., or you're going to get Washington, D.C. It's not going to make any mistakes there. And finally, we're interested in licensed stations. So that's this variable called FAC status.
Now, when you're trying to figure out what you want to set these various variables to, like you might say to yourself, well, how do you know that fact status is licensed? Well, there's a couple ways you can figure that out. Number one is, I mentioned we have this engineering data description document. Oftentimes that's going to spell out the various values that a field can take. But another way to do it, and probably the better way to do it, is what Eugene did earlier, which was selecting rows out of the table, because then you can go down the rows in the table, and this is what I would do, and there's the status column, and you can figure out, fairly quickly what these various statuses mean. And you realize that status, LICEN, these are your licensed stations, is fairly self-explanatory. So, it's actually fairly easy to figure out what to set these things to. Obviously, when you're doing city and state, it's like, well, Washington, D.C., that's self-explanatory. But for these fields like, license status, there are several ways to figure out very easily what the parameters are of what you need to look for.
Yep. And so this last line, order by, is essentially a sort. We can say, in this case, I've decided to sort it by the call sign. It basically says, once it outputs what you're interested in, do you want to sort it by a particular field? And so if we run this, we want to highlight this and click the little yellow lightning bolt. And there you go. It returned 8 results. And, we're satisfied that the service type for each of them is DT, digital television. We have exactly what we asked for. We have the call sign of the station. We have a column with the associated facility ID of the station. And if you notice, the call sign is, in fact, sorted alphabetically. To double check that we're getting everything from Washington, here it is. Community city is Washington. And actually, if you notice, it's not case sensitive. So we asked for like Washington lowercase, but it's cool with that. It doesn't mind that we're not this is capital letters, and state is DC. And so, one of the most powerful things about query language is it's very easy to change something small and get new results. So, for example, let's say we're interested in, instead of Washington D.C., something like Albany, and obviously the state would be New York. And we'd like to rerun this query. Well, no problem. Albany, New York, and these are the 3 stations we get, and their new facility, or rather their facility IDs, their service type, and then sort of the party name or the licensee, the station licensee.
This is actually a good place for me to reiterate a point that I made earlier, which is that you'll notice that we're pulling data out of here, and we're using facility ID. We are, in fact, pulling the call sign. The database knows that the current call sign for 74422 is WTEN. We can pull that data out, but running this query based on call sign would not be effective because that's not the linkage. And the reason it's not the linkage is because it's not a unique station identifier. All these linkages involve unique identifiers, so we are uniquely identifying facility by facility ID.
Yep.
So
Any questions on that query? Sure.
Is it just the community of license, or is there also the market?
Nielsen DMA data is proprietary, so it's not in our database. There is a field. One thing that you will find about databases, and I know this from helping develop them, is sometimes there'll be a field in a data table that is from a data artifact from a long time ago that doesn't exist anymore or isn't really done anymore. And the reason you do that is because when you're writing all this code, the law of unintended consequences says that if you delete a field from a table, you cross your fingers, but you're worried that you're going to break something that depended on it way back when and have to redo something. And so it's very common to leave a legacy field in a database that is no longer used, and we'll see some of those even in the ownership structure table. So you will see there's a field in our database called Nielsen DMA that is a legacy field. We don't have the ability to put that data in our database, and because it's proprietary data from Nielsen, it's not our data.
So how are you supposed to know how many stations are in the platform?
Well, you can do research to figure that out. I mean, there are sources of information out there from Nielsen where you can look that up. I mean, that's not.
You would have to, I mean, it would depend on what your relationship with Nielsen was and your knowledge of Nielsen was, but theoretically you could go and get what information you needed to from Nielsen and cross-reference it with our database, but the commission we don't have the legal right to include the Nielsen proprietary data in our database.
When I was in private practice, there were books that came out that had all this information that you could get. Yeah, I thought they have been. They've not put them out.
I think they're available online if you purchase them.
Yeah, they're available somehow, but I don't think they make the books anymore.
Yeah, they don't do it on
the yearbook.
They do it
online
on the internet.
Yeah. So the short answer to your question is that information is available, but it isn't ours. That's the short answer.
Sorry, what state is DC? Yeah, so you change this to Albany. Oh, even when you don't change the state? Yeah, right, so you change the state. And then run, and yep.
Yep.
Oh, yes, that's actually a good point. I should have mentioned. So this is how you create comments in your code. So anything that you want to comment out, it's going to turn this sort of pale gray color, and you do that by creating this /* as sort of the start of the comment. So, for example, if I get rid of this, if I get rid of the end comment, it's going to comment out everything until the next comment exists.
This is a very common feature of programming languages. They tend to provide a mechanism where you can put words in your code to explain what your code is doing or why you're doing it or what's going on. And the way it's done in MySQL, again, is with this / and an asterisk on both sides, and then it understands this is not code to run. This is just sitting here to explain things. We're going to go through a code example where we're going to walk through some stuff that I wrote, and there's a lot of comments in there that way to explain it going on. So yeah, that's what that gray stuff means.
And so, for example, I just uncommented it, and you instantly get an error because there is no find command in SQL.
That's not code. It doesn't know what that is.
So yeah, we can go back and comment this again. And so, yeah, that's the reason that doesn't change, is because that's something I wrote as for the example. But let's real quick go back to the original, which was Washington, D.C. And so let's say you run this, and you get this output, and you look at the party name, and you say, oh, look, a few of these stations belong to Fox. And what if, for example, you're interested in finding out all stations that Fox has an ownership interest in?
All full power.
All full power, for example. So how would you do something like that? Again, using sort of non-biennial tables. We'll actually replicate this query using the biennial reports in a little bit and show you how that matches it up. So let's say you want to run this query on all Fox stations. How would you do it? So you start again with your select statement. Let's say you want the call sign, facility ID, service type, pretty much the same information that you wanted before. And again, you need this party table, so the data structure is going to be exactly the same. It's going to be this exact same facility table to fact party, and then fact party to party, because we're going to use the party table to ask for Fox stations. So you do the exact same thing in terms of selecting what you'd like, creating using the inner join command to join facility to the fact party table on facility ID, and then joining fact party to party on the party ID, which is this A to B, B to C linkage. And again, you want digital television. But this time, you want to specify that you want the party name to be Fox Television. Or you could even do Fox and see what you get. It's actually interesting. So, you do Fox, and you're probably going to end up. Actually, why not? Let's do just Fox. So you just do Fox. And again, you want it to be licensed. And at the end, just ordered it by call sign. So let's run this. And so what do you get? Well, you get 23 rows. And by the way, if you are interested in continuing to use MySQL, this right here is on the top right where my mouse currently is. It's actually very important. You can tell it to either remove this sort of bottom row or bottom tab that appears, or keep it. And this is the action output, it's called. It basically tells you, what did you just run? How many rows did it return? How long did it take? And if something screws up, it'll give you an error message there, and that's actually useful for troubleshooting. So, but for now, we saw that it's 23 rows. We don't really need it, so you can sort of take that out. And so, pretty much everything says Fox Television, right? And it gives you the call sign, the facility ID, all the information we wanted. But randomly, we get this KFOX licensee LLC. And why did we get that? Well, because we wanted everything that had the word Fox somewhere in it. And so KFOX, it shows up. So, and that's something to notice. You have to be sort of, you have to know a little bit about what you're looking for and be able to make write the query the way you want it. And then if it gives you something additional, then you have to be able to recognize what that is. So, for example, if you change it to Fox Television and you rerun it, now it just went from 23 results to 22, and that KFOX is gone. And it has all. And so this is basically the 22 stations that Fox currently has an ownership interest in. Any questions about that query?
This is
So
not
actually-
the ownership report data. This
actually,
is the station data.
this
We're starting
is-
with the station data. But you're making a good point that we're going to revisit in a little bit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's actually what we're going to visit next. But this result is going to be current as of basically this morning, because we're using the party table, which is not one of the tables derived from the last round of the 323 biennial filings.
Remember, biennial filings tell you what ownership looked like at a specific time. These tables are telling you what ownership looks like now.
But again, it's limited in that it doesn't have some
Right.
very relevant information like race, ethnicity, gender, and certain other things that we may or may not be interested in.
We're just
Yeah.
starting out with this as a simple example. You had a question? Yeah.
Can you still use that search to find, let's say there's an individual who might stock them up with different licenses. Can you search?
Absolutely.
We are going
We're
to get
actually
to a
gonna-
search that could be very much modified to do that. Yes, but not from this station data. That you would pull from an ownership report.
But we will actually do a search, much like what
Yeah.
you're asking, and
Right,
we'll
right.
show you how it goes. It's going to be
Well, that is coming
not
up
too far
shortly.
from now. Yep.
Yep.
And so these are some very basic queries within this MySQL workbench. And again, these are some of the most important queries you're going to run because they allow you to combine tables based on the relational structure and the relational linkages between them. They let you pull the certain variables that you may be interested in. They let you condition your search on certain characteristics that you may be interested in. And you can see how easy it is to change certain constraints and get completely different output. If you're interested in a different market, you can change the market. If you're interested in a different licensee, you can change the licensee name. And so it's a very powerful tool. But let's say you actually want to do this through the ownership tables, because I know a lot of us are interested in that. So the next thing we want to do is sort of show you how to relate the ownership tables, or rather the ownership reports that we went through earlier, to the actual ownership tables in the database. So Jake can talk about that.
Okay, well, let's start with, you have a handout in your packet that looks like this. It's got a bunch of tables and lines with 3 yellow tops. And then why don't you just pull out just one of these ownership reports that we went through earlier. Any of them will do, just we need a report with the structure. I think one thing that is probably fairly clear based on what we've covered so far is that ownership data is pretty complicated. Comes in a lot of forms. There's a lot of information on the reports. And so it probably will not come to much of a surprise that the ownership report data structure is also fairly complicated. So what I've done here is a chart that attempts to explain it, and it probably looks like gobbledygook now, but I don't think it will after we've done a little run through. So the first, in the middle there, one of the first yellow highlighted tables is called ownership report. This is your main table for the ownership data. Every ownership report has, every electronically filed ownership report that corresponds to one of these paper documents that we went through has a unique number. It's called the application ID. And again, there's one record and ownership report for every application ID, for every ownership report. From there, you branch out to other tables that contain some of the information that is reported on the ownership report. And let's focus on the other two that we're really going to care about for the examples we go through today. You see at the bottom left, there's ownership group. Do you see that one there? I've noted in that box that is section 1, question 7 of the report. That's where you list the licensee and the stations. So for every application ID, there is a linkage between that table and the main application ID field and ownership group. So that's how those two tables are linked together. And you'll see that in that table we have things like call sign, service, facility ID. So this is where it's listing the various station records that are in section 1, question 7 of the report. So if you're looking at an ownership report with, application ID is a number assigned by the system to manage the data. But if you wanted to know what stations were on application ID 1, 2, 3, that application would be identified by 1, 2, 3 in the application ID in the ownership report table, and all the records in ownership group would have a main application ID field of 123. That's how those would link up. Now, there can be many ownership records in ownership group that correspond to the application ID. So that makes sense, right? Because in section 1, question 7, you can list multiple stations. So this is a mechanism for putting, this is how that data is stored. There's many records in ownership group associated with the application for each of the stations. Something that will be useful to you, for you to know later, is another piece of information in this table is the app ARN. Do you see that top field? That's actually related to the file number. I mentioned this application ID. Application IDs are created by the database itself to sort of relate data together. File numbers are assigned when applications are filed. So in ownership group, there is a field called app ARN, and then there's a field called file prefix. File prefix is your BOA or your ARBON, and the app ARN is the 2013, 12, 18 ECS at the top of that, the file stamp. And an interesting thing that is not obvious at first is that ownership reports have main file numbers. But in fact, when you submit them to the FCC, each station on the report gets its own unique file number. So if this report had 4 other stations on it, ECS would be its main file number. It would be attached to the first call sign, but then there would also be ECT, ECU, ECB, ECW. And you'll see how that works. App ARN, there's an app ARN for each station because each station gets a file number. The main file number is always the first of these sequentially. So if you had a bunch of ownership group records for the same report, there'd be a bunch of different app ARNs. The first one sequentially is the main file number, but in fact every station gets its own file number, which can be useful for certain queries that we're not going to do today, but it can be useful for the stations to have their own file number, and that's in fact what happens. Ownership structure. This, and I noted at the bottom, this is section 2, question 3A. This is where the ownership interests that we churned through are stored. Again, application ID, ownership report links to that table, application ID, and there's many records in the ownership structure table that are related to that same application ID. Why? Because for a given ownership report application, there's multiple responses to that question, right? There's the respondent, and then we listed all the interest holders and the officers and directors. All of those records are in this table under linked by the application ID, and you can see the fields in here are pretty self-explanatory. But you got an FRN field down there, which is good because that's the unique identifier. Names. We got office held, which is an old field for holding offices, actually. Now we got the positional interest information. This corresponds. If you look at the ownership report, there's various ways that they can report their positional interest: officer, director, partner, limited partner, member. Those are what's stored in those fields. Underneath that is a field, or a bunch of fields that start with the word race. Those are the fields that are used to track racial categorization, which is what a lot of people are often interested in that. I do want to make a note here. Those of you who followed these reports may be aware of this, that we changed the way that ownership reports collected race, and that was due to a directive from OMB about how that gets collected. On the old version of the form, if we'll look at the form right now, if you go to one of the section 3A records, if you look on I guess, yeah, go to section 3A and find one of the records where it lets you pick the racial categories. Is everybody there? So just pick any of the reports and go to question 3A and pick a record. There's these check boxes here for the racial categories. Do you see those? The way that we collect the information now is people can check as many of these boxes as apply to them. So if somebody is biracial, they can click 2 boxes. It used to be that instead of this approach, we had racial categories and then one that was 2 or more races, and you could only select one of them at a given time. So you see how we've changed the way the data is collected. It basically allows for more fine-grained collection of that data. We talked a little bit earlier in response to one of Angela's question about legacy fields. If you look in the race fields in this chart, in the ownership structure, there's a field called race _FLG. That is the field that was used when we collected the data the old way, because you only had one category, so we could just sort of assign 5 different values to it, and you would know what category you're in. But now that you have check boxes and you can specify multiple categories, we needed to make separate race fields for each of them. So if you're doing searches on recent ownership data, do not use the race flag variable. That's a legacy field. Again, you keep those in because you don't want to do the harm that you might do by taking them out of the database. But the race American, Indian, race Asian, race black, race Hawaiian, race white are the fields that really are active in the last couple rounds of ownership reports, I believe. So in any event, so those are your section 2 question 3A records and ownership structure. And I put those 3 tables in yellow because those are what we're going to focus on in our examples. I want to do a very quick run through the rest of the tables just so you know what they are. I mentioned that there was a question about stock capitalization on the ownership report that we just skipped over because it wasn't relevant to our examples. That's what's in this ownership capitalization table. Again, it's linked by application ID, and it allows them to provide various information about shares. There's a one-to-many relationship because there could be many different shares of stock. Again, they can make multiple answers there. The next table down there, that's the contracts question where they listed the contracts they have to file with the FCC. If you look underneath ownership report, there's a table called ownership other interest XML data, and there's also to the right at the top there's one that's just called ownership other interest. These are tables that store if they provide these exhibits with other broadcast interests. That data is in these tables. There's 2 mechanisms where people can provide that information. One, they can enter it into the form itself. If they do that, it ends up in the table at the top right called ownership other interests. They do it via an XML file that they can upload, which is easier. Sometimes it ends up in this other table. Basically, those tables together contain those other broadcast information, other broadcast interest information. We talked about attribution exemptions. We talked about that one question that said, can you exempt from attribution some of your officers or directors? That's what's in this ownership exemptions table to the far right. The relationships table is the question about people if they're married to each other. Or so all the other information is in these tables. Pretty self-explanatory as to where it is. The fields sort of are named in a way that makes it intelligible. We're going to be focusing on these 3 tables in yellow. Again, ownership report, which is the main table for the report, ownership group, which is basically the stations on the report, and ownership structure, which basically contains the people and entities with an attributable interest that are reported on the filing. Does that make sense to everybody? It's fairly clear where the data is. If you look at this document beside the form, we went through it in a fair amount of detail, but it's fairly easy to match the questions to the tables. But I've done that for you in those little gray boxes to help you along. But yeah, it's complicated because the data is complicated, and you can't put simple complicated data into a simple structure because it just doesn't work. It doesn't make it useful. So.
Okay, so now that we know how the ownership report tables, or rather the ownership reports, are put into these various tables and how they're connected, why don't we try to replicate an earlier query, or actually the last query we did, which was pulling out all stations that Fox has an ownership interest in. Let's pull that out using the 2013 biennial ownership data. And so here on the PowerPoint we have the 3 main tables that Jake just described, and again, he already discussed sort of the main relational connections between the 3 of them, and this is what we're going to be using. And so, how would we go about doing this? So we want to find all Fox stations, or Fox-owned stations, through 323 ownership. So when I was thinking about this, I thought one interesting way was to say, well, we sort of know one for sure. We know WNYW. Why don't we figure out the FRN of the licensee for that station? We know Fox is the licensee. How do we get the FRN number? Well, we know that's in the ownership report table. We want to select the licensee FRN, but we want to make sure that it belongs to to Fox, so it belongs to the licensee of WNYW. So we have to join the ownership report table to ownership group, and that connection is made by from application ID in ownership report to main application ID in ownership group. And so this is our typical inner join command. And again, where the call sign, which is housed in the ownership group table, is WNYW. And this actually isn't necessary, but I just told it to remove any results that may have a blank LICFRN, which there shouldn't be any anyway. And so if you run this, you get the licensee FRN, and that is the licensee FRN of Fox. And so the reason we got one, we were going to get lots of results because obviously Fox has an ownership interest in a lot of stuff. Why did we get one? Well, it's because I told it to select distinct. And we were just going to get this licensee FRN repeating down for all of those stations. And we just want to know what it is. So I told it to select distinct, and then we just get one output. It just collapses it down to just this one.
So it's very easy to do a query that gets the FRN of the licensee of the station you're interested in based on the ownership data.
Right. And so that's part one. And this is just a two-part query, so not that complicated. Once we have this licensee's FRN, we basically want to pull all of its stations and some relevant information that we may be interested in. And so I basically created a new table to do this. I say the first line just says drop this table if it exists to sort of refresh it and start over. Second table says create it if it doesn't exist, and we called it Fox owned, and we created as the following. We select the call sign, the facility ID, the city and state, the service type, and the name of the licensee to make sure we're getting what we want from ownership group. And again, we make our sort of similar linkage between ownership group and ownership report on the application ID, where the licensee FRN in ownership report is the following. It's 00005795067. It's what we pulled out from the previous query. And we only want to use the 2013, the most recent round of biennial ownership data. So we say where the ARN is like 2013. So notice how the percent sign is only on one side, meaning we want it to start with 2013, and then whatever comes after, that's fine. We just want to make sure that the year of the biennial round is the 2013 round.
So that's the files tab, making sure it's a 2013 filing.
Right. And lastly, we want to make sure that sort of the file prefix, which Jake mentioned a couple of times, is either BOA or BOR. And then we want to select everything from this table that we just created. So select star from Fox owned. If you run that, you get 22 stations. So if you remember, we got 22 stations when we ran it through the from the non-ownership, or rather from the party table, which is not part of the biennial ownership reporting. So the question is, did we get the exact same results? And if so, yes, and if not, then possibly why not? And so we sort of did that a little analysis for you, and here is the output from it. Let me zoom out just a little bit. Well, let's first zoom in a little bit. And so from the non-ownership data that's on the left, the results from the ownership data, which we just pulled, are on the right. And we've highlighted the differences for you. So everything else is the same. So 20 out of 22 are identical. These two are different. These two are different. These two exist in the non-ownership report query, but don't exist in the biennial ownership data. Likewise, these two exist in the biennial ownership data, but are not found in the party table.
And so the question is,
why?
Why? Is there something wrong with our query, or what's going on, do you think? So what's the purpose of the 2013 biennial data? That's reporting ownership as of a given point in time. October 1st, 2013. So these results on the right of that slide, that is what Fox owned in 2013, October 1. On the left, following up on Brendan's question, that's non-ownership data. That's querying not our ownership report data, our station data right now. What does Fox own? And that's that. So they don't own the same stations now. There was a transaction that Fox did with a third party since the last biennial round where they basically swapped two stations with them. Fox has two stations now that it didn't have before, and has lost two stations. They have the same number of stations, but two have been swapped out. And that's very important. I was glad that the results of these two queries did not come out the same when we were preparing this, because it's always important to remember from the data perspective, what am I looking at? What have I asked for? What am I being told? And the 2013 biennial data is not telling you what people have now. It's telling you what people had on the biennial filing date. That is because the purpose of the biennial reports is to track ownership as of a date certain over time so it can be compared and studied. They are lines in the sand on a specific date every 2 years. And so they're not going to be up to date with transactions that have happened since then, because that is not the purpose of the filing.
Yep. So any questions on how we ran that query?
Eugene, can I ask you, how did you get to focus on 2013 again? Is that using from the final number?
That's a good question. If you go back to the handout of the ownership structure, I mentioned that in the ownership group table, that's where the file number is stored. So we searched on that field and said we want that field to look like 2013 something.
Yep, that's the app ARN variable.
Yep.
In the ownership group.
And then the prefix, we said BOA or BOR. We want it to be biennial 2013.
And that's right here, highlighting it inside of the query. Right. And so I think there was an earlier question about what if we wanted to do this for an individual? We wanted to pull out their ownership interests. And so we could actually do that for you. We can go back to actually one of the examples that Jake went over.
Yeah. I want you to flip to the next slide.
Sure.
Do we remember this fund that we had earlier in the seminar? We found out that Mr. Lewis Wall 100% votes that licensee. Remember, we found that out by our run through the report. Then we looked at the ownership exhibit, and we found out that he had 2 other stations. So, what if we query the ownership data for his FRN? We should expect those 2 stations to come out, right? Wouldn't you think? So let's run that.
Okay.
And show how that works. Again, show the same data structure. It's not any different data structure-wise.
Yep. And so before we do that, we're going to do this little alter table thing where we're indexing a couple of the variables to search by. And this may take 10-15 seconds to run, but it may save you 10-15 minutes if you're doing something that requires processing a large number of rows of data. So you actually see how it's doing. This will tell you right here, and it's pretty much finished. And so what do we want to do here? We want to select the FRN, the call sign, the facility, some other stuff, the city, the state, the service type, from the ownership structure table. And again, that's the table with the sort of individual interest holders, information on them. We want to join that to the ownership group table, as we've done before on the application ID. And we want to make sure we pick out the FRN of this individual. So, right here, we know his FRN. It's 0019330562. That's what we've selected here, 0019330562. Again, we're looking for the most recent round. And again, we're selecting the file prefixes that we're accustomed to. And there you go. You get 19 results. But let's sort by vote percentage, for example. And here you'll find these are going to be the 3 stations that we just discussed.
Yep. Next slide.
Yes.
Yep. Remember, the KXLT on the right was the one that we found, FAC ID 35906, and then on the ownership exhibit we knew that there were 2 more stations, 3, and those are the 3 that he has highlighted here. So we returned those stations as we expected.
Yep, here we go. But we also returned a whole bunch of other stuff. And that is because he's going, very frequently, like we saw when we churn through these reports, somebody will have 0 voting shares but still be an attributable interest holder because they're an officer. And so basically this guy is an officer on a number of other stations.
And has, yeah. Right.
And so that's why we get these additional results, these additional rows.
Mm-hmm. And so, next slide.
Yep.
So the question here is basically, and we've answered it, why did we retrieve additional stations? because what we learned from that ownership exhibit about him having those 2 other stations, that wasn't the whole story. He's got more. And we picked those up. If you go to the next slide, remember how when we were going through the report, one more, we were going through the report for the licensee, I said there's another broadcast exhibit that we were going to skip for now and I was going to revisit later. This is what that exhibit looks like. And that exhibit in ownership reports, basically what you do is the filer discloses any other broadcast interests that are held by the person listed on the report. And if we looked at that other broadcast exhibit, we would have seen the ones in yellow are the 3 that we already knew about, KXLT, WWMB, KZTB, and their facility ID numbers. And these green ones are the new ones that we picked up, that he actually has an ownership interest in through another structure. What does that other structure look like? It's complicated. You could churn through these reports. We'll show you how. But we didn't. There's a reason why I didn't do the manual example of these reports, going through it by hand, because that would have taken forever. But he figures in this ownership structure. And we basically uncovered that fact by noting that his unique FRN appeared as an attributable interest holder on the reports for the stations in this ownership structure. We had 5 or 6 stations, and they are held in these licensees, various licensees. And he figures in that ownership structure as an officer and a director and a small interest holder, as I recall. And again, we picked that up from the ownership reports. Interestingly, though, we'll revisit these stations. It will come up again in a later example where we are doing some automated querying of SQL. And they'll show us how powerful it is to do this in an automated way rather than by distinct queries. Are there any questions about this? Angela, you had a lot of questions. Does that answer your question about getting the person out, or do you still...
As well as it can. I don't have my computer doesn't the software, so I hardly really see. Thank you.
But the general point is that, the FRN uniquely identifies that person, and that's how you would pull him or her out.
So what if someone has used special use
Special use FRNs, when people use those, they are supposed to use the same special use FRN consistently. So, if they have done that, you should be able to query on the special use FRN the same way.
So they have it, you know,
Yeah.
That is touching on.
Yeah, that's right. That's something that's been discussed in one of our pending proceedings.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, the touches on that.
So you could use that to search for.
You could use that to search with, absolutely. And it sits in the same field, FRN. So anybody who uses special use FRN is in that same field.
You want to take a break before this part, or do you want to go through?
Just do that right now. Yeah. Right. Okay, so again, this workshop is building from the simple to the complicated. And it's building from doing things by hand and manually to doing things by SQL and then doing things in an automated way. So before we hit lunch, I guess I'm going to go through this next part of the slides, which is the report analysis methodology. And let me introduce it by saying this. I think we went through the reports, and it was fairly clear how to do it, but the question isn't how to do it by hand. The question is, how could you instruct a machine to do it for you? How could you automate that process? How does it work? Well, here is an example that I hope will help us figure out a methodology for doing that. Let me go to the next slide. So what we want to do is come up with some sort of algorithm that can be followed to do the kind of ownership analysis we did with these reports to come up with how ownership interests are held. And here's sort of what there's probably many ways to skin this cat, by the way. That's how data works. You can figure out 50,000 different ways to do it. Here's what we came up with. Start with creating a chart that you're going to use to analyze the reports. The chart has the following columns: report number, file number, that's the file number of the report, the BOA 2013, whatever, the name of the respondent, the FRN, whether that person, that respondent is a person or an entity, what report that person appears on, the voting interest on that report, and we've got this field called votes calculation, which I'll get into, and then a progress field, done. So first thing I'm going to go back to our Sagamore Hill example. First thing you would do is add a row of information for the licensee report and treat that as the current report you're thinking about. So we give it the report number 1. That's the first report we've added to the table. You know the file number of it, the filing, which matches the filing number on the report. We know the name. We have the FRN. It is an entity. Because it is the licensee, this is not an interest holder on a report. This is the bottom of the chain, which is why the appears on is blank. And the licensee report always has 100% of the votes because it's the licensee. Then what do? Next thing we did was we looked at the interest holders on the report. And so you would add a unique row for each interest holder on a report. Here we remember that we had Sagamore Hill of Minnesota was the interest holder on that report. We had a new row for its report. We call that report number 2. Give it its file number, name, FRN, what it is, entity or person, what report it appears on. Here it appeared on report number 1. When you add these records, you link them to what report they appeared on. And the votes on the report is 100. How do you figure out votes calculation? This goes back to multiplying voting interest through. And that's where we track what report it appears on. We know that it appears on report number 1, 100. It appears with 100% of the votes. That's what's listed on the report. And we know that that report itself represents 100% of the votes because that was licensee entity. So you end up multiplying the votes on the report by the real votes that are represented by the report it appears on. So here, on this report, it has 100% of the votes of this entity, so it's 100%. That's the multiplying through the chain. Okay. Mark the report you're working on as done. Move to the next report, which is the report that you just added. So in other words, the idea here is that you cycle through reports until you're done. You added one report for the licensee, and you've analyzed its interest holder. You're done. Your next step is to move on to the next report on the table that you've listed that you have not done an analysis for. That's report number 2. And then you repeat the same steps. Step 3, you look at that report. Click the next one for me. And you've gone to the report for Sagamore Hill of Minnesota LLC. And you've gone through its interest holders, and you've noticed that you've got another entity that's going to have another report, Sagamore Hill Midwest. You list that with its file number, its FRN, note that it's an entity, and what report it appears on. Here it appears on report number 2. So what you're going to do is you're going to take the votes. It reported 100% of votes on the report, but you're going to multiply that by the prior report's voting interest to figure out what it really represents in the licensee. This one's an easy one because every link is 100%. But you would see that if you had a 50% voting share, if you had 100% on that report, that would really represent 50% in the licensee. And you multiply that through. Then you mark that report done. Move to the next report. Then go through. Then you would add the final report in the chain. You would go to the final report in the chain, Sagamore Hill Midwest. That's report number 3. And you would list its interest holders. Here, the interest holder is a person, right? Because we got to the end of the entities, and it was a person. So people don't file ownership reports. So you just add a record for Lewis Wall, who's reported on that report. His FRN, he's a person. He appears on report number 3 with 100% of the votes. So his 100% of the votes on the report represents 100% of whatever report 3's votes was, which is 100%. So he has 100% of the votes too as well. And you see you don't put in all that information for people because people don't have ownership reports. They just have voting interests that are reported. So that's his row. You mark that report, done. You move on to the next one. But we don't have any more. We're done. So what do we do now? You use the completed chart to determine the voting interest held by the reporting parties. So now you can look at this chart, and each row of that chart tells you what voting interests are ultimately held by the people on those reports. This is a simple example because everything's 100, but I wanted to explain how the methodology worked. Now, couple things to note about this methodology, and this goes back to ownership interests, and ownership information is complicated. When you're doing a chart like this, oftentimes you will end up generating rows for the same people, multiple rows for the same people. That could happen very easily. It is very common for there to be multiple entities in an ownership structure, and a person may have a chunk of interest in different places. Like suppose in the example of Sagamore Hill, suppose Lewis Wall had taken off like 10% interest on each of those steps. He would appear in this table 3 times. How would you handle that? You would handle that by summing the rows in that table that share the FRN. All of Lewis Wall's rows would say, Lewis Wall, here's my FRN, here's my ultimate voting interest for that report. You add them together and you get a total voting interest for him. Similarly, sometimes the same entity will appear more than once in your analysis chart. That will happen when ownership structures get complicated and feature situations like this, where entity 3 actually gets voting interests through 2 different chains. It has a direct interest in entity 1, and it also has a direct interest in entity 2, which itself has an interest in entity 1. This may seem bizarre, but this happens a lot. Tax reasons, bank reasons, ownership structures that exhibit this kind of situation are not uncommon. Again, the way this methodology works is it essentially handles each time the report is relevant as a separate report, which is why we number the reports and don't just go by their file numbers. And so if you have multiple rows for the same entity, how would you figure out what that represents? You would sum them up. So multiple rows will occur in this analogy, in this algorithm analysis, and it is designed to do that because it's designed to be able to track the interests as they flow through various mechanisms. You'll probably, just to whet your appetite for what's happening, this chart that we've created is a lot like a data table, and these steps we have done are a lot like queries, and there's sort of an algorithmic process you can follow to run these queries, to write these tables, to do these sorts of analyses. So probably not a surprise, but the next thing we're going to do is show how you could automate this kind of analysis via SQL to classify station ownership. And that is the fun for after the break. Are there any questions? Yeah, I think we're again running a little early, so why don't we just go ahead and take lunch?
Okay, lunchtime.
How long are we waiting for?
Like an hour.
Hour for lunch?
Yeah, an hour. Yeah, why don't you be back by 1? This is running early. That's true. So it's just that there were no better offers. Okay, I guess we'll start anyway. We got a couple people that I thought were coming back but are not here. Maybe they'll straggle in. So I'm going to take us a little off track here because we've been having computer problems here, but it looks like CDBS came back this morning while we were working. So we wanted to go back to when we were discussing about accessing the data. We mentioned that there were two ways to get at it. There was the CDBS public access, which is good for searching, making small searches and finding things, quick information. And then there's sort of the downloading the data, which is where you get the stuff you really want to work with in a serious way. Let's talk about CDBS public access here. In the slides, we actually had included the search screen for getting application information. And that was because we anticipated looking at some other screens on CDBS during the presentation. The one that really is useful for the ownership reports is this one that's labeled Search Ownership Report information right here. So if you were to click that, you get a query screen that's not all that different than the one you just saw, but it has a few more fields that are more sensible for ownership reports. You can search them by call sign, FAC ID. Again, FAC ID is the better search for making sure you get the same station. You can get biennials. The first two options here are biennials. The rest are sort of non-biennial reports. Commercial stations, channels, community of license, the kind of thing that you would think you could search on, where the station is, the licensee, the filing entity. How did I get these reports for Sagamore Hill that we went through before? Well, there's several different ways I could have done that. The quickest way would have been to put in its FAC ID, which is 35906, I believe. It looks like I've already searched for that before. That's a good sign. Well, no. It may be.
You get the application.
Oh, there we go. Thank you.
No problem.
I had selected something I shouldn't have. And you see these first three here are the reports that we looked through. I was having a hard time highlighting them. There we go. I guess that's right. So you see these match the file numbers that we had pulled. And then you just click this link. And is this going to work? Looks like it's going to. It'll pull up the application that we looked at. There it is. Obviously, if you could have done a more fine-grained search, mimicking some of what we've done, if we had said BOA in our search, we see we get only their biennial reports through time. If we had limited it, as we had in other cases, to 2013, and this use of the percent sign sort of as a fuzzy search in SQL, that works here too, because this is basically a front end for some SQL queries. If we had done that, we would have pulled up the three we wanted. So that's how I got to those. But you see, there's a fairly robust way to search these reports here. But again, this isn't really what you would want to do if you were doing some serious studying of the data. And in here, we did some queries of the station database. This station search is where you could run some of those simple queries as well. Query by licensee like we did, query by a FAC ID, city state, that we could run the Washington D.C. query from here and the Fox query from here. And this other stuff is interesting as well, but sort of station and application, that really mimics sort of what some of the stuff we've done already. And then this is this link here. We've included a direct link to the downloaded engineering data in the PowerPoint, but you can get it here as well, and hopefully this will come up as well. So this is what we were talking about earlier. This is the download data database. These are the resources that can help you. There's a README, a code table. This can tell you what the fields mean, and in some cases the values they can take. This engineering data description is a pretty large PDF file that lists all the tables and the fields. These are all the data tables that you can download. You get them FTP. You can get them that way. They're all zip files. You download them, you unzip them, and you can put them in whatever system you want.
In general, I'd start with the HTTP one. The FTP one doesn't always work as well, but HTTP works easier.
So the information, again, look, it says here, automated updates nightly between 4:15 and 5:15 a.m. So hopefully you're asleep while that's going on. And wake up in the morning, and if you want new data, there it is for you. It's pretty easy. There's this link here for 2009 biennial ownership files. When the first form revision was done, we revised this form in 2009, and that's how we ended up with getting all the data in these database fields that could be searched. When they did that the first time, they ran a separate sort of compact database that had just the 2009 biennial data in it. All of that data is in the main database tables, so there's no need, that's not additional. So if you want to do sort of overtime studies of all the ownership data, I would just skip that and just download the data tables. Everything's in there. I just wanted to make clear that that's not data you haven't seen before. So fairly easy.
I'd also draw your attention to the code table that's linked on there, and that's a very, very helpful file when you're trying to understand what some of the different fields mean. You can look through there and have more of a plain text description of what codes in the tables mean.
Yep.
Yeah, it's done
Here
by
are all the
table.
application types. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's all the large headers are the table names, and underneath them are the fields. No, those are the fields.
The field names.
The field,
and
right.
then the categories.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So it's very easy to figure. Like we had that one query about we wanted to make sure a station was licensed, and it's not necessarily obvious exactly what that field's going to be, but this table would tell you.
And one more second.
That doesn't work.
Yeah, that's not that one.
Yeah.
This one right here.
Yeah.
And here into the description.
Doesn't work there either. Go down here though. That's useful stuff.
Yes, this is the page.
Yeah.
And this is again the relational tables that we put together for you. We basically used this structure and this README file when we did that. Again, there's the table name at the top. You can disregard the number, but here are the column names and the variable types for all of the tables in CDBS.
Scroll down, you'll see the ownership tables are in there.
Yeah, the ownership tables.
So
are in there.
the point of this is that there's plenty of resources to help you figure out the data. It's not opaque. You can look things up fairly quickly and figure out the answers to questions like what is the value of this field or what's in this field. So, okay. Now back to our regularly scheduled programming. So when we left off before lunch, we had just gone through a methodology for churning through ownership reports to determine station ownership, and it involved making a table and listing rows in that table for the various reports and the various interest holders on the reports, and ultimately being able to use that table to do an analysis or a calculation of votes. That was sort of a specific example we were using. So here, one of the things that people are very interested in is minority ownership of stations. And so we decided, let's take a very specific example of that and see how to automate it and run through that. And that would be a useful teaching tool. And then we can talk about maybe how to generalize that to other questions. So let's ask a more specific question than tell me about minority-owned stations. Let's say we really wanted to know full-power TV stations that had owners who identified as racially Asian in the 2013 biennial round. Well, if you think about our earlier methodology, it's pretty simple to modify that. I've laid out sort of new headings for the table, the analysis table, and what you would do is you would just add a column that would track whether the votes you were finding were held by an Asian individual or not. Obviously, if the votes are held by an entity, then the answer there is no. If they're held by an individual, they're going to be either racially Asian or not. And how are you going to know that? You're going to know that because there's a flag in the ownership structure table that people check to identify themselves as Asian. So we go through the same methodology, and then at the end, we would want to sum the votes or look at the votes in that table that were attributable to Asian individuals. And so that's how you could look at a specific report and say, I'm going to look at this report and churn it through the analysis and see what category it's in. But that would still involve going through a large number of reports and it's still very tedious to do that by hand, and it's hard to figure out where to start. So this is a perfect example of the kind of thing that you might want to automate with SQL. So we've talked about sort of the details of the analysis, but actually to start this process, and it's often the case working with big data, it's useful to think about what cuts can you make at the data right away to sort of reduce what you're even looking at in the first place. So take a look at the big picture. This is sort of a pro tip generally to those of you who work with data. Instead of worrying about how we're going to sort of really do these calculations, worry about what we don't even need to worry about to consider. For example, 2013 biennial reports. That's all we want. The ownership report database is huge. We can take a big cut at it right away by saying, let's only look at the 2013 biennial reports. We don't really care about anything else. Plus, we know that regardless of the details of exactly how a station's ownership plays out, we know that if a station has filed no reports that disclosed anybody who was Asian who had any votes, those reports are irrelevant. So we can figure out which stations filed one or more reports that had an interest holder with votes that was racially Asian, pull them out and ignore the rest. That is a huge cut at the data set right from the get-go. We eliminate all the stations that don't satisfy, all the reports that don't satisfy these criteria, and we can do that by simple SQL queries, and we're going to show that in a few minutes. But this still leaves a large number of stations to analyze. If I looked at the 2013 biennial ownership data and pulled out all the stations that had a report that disclosed at least one person who was Asian and who had votes, and that was still 34 stations, so that's a lot of stations to go through by hand, and 350 reports, and that's a lot of reports to go through by hand. So the key to making this task manageable is automating the SQL. And that is fairly easy to do. And I'll admit that this is some of the tougher sledding of this workshop, but I printed out here the code that does this, and I do not intend to go through every query line by line and explain how it works, because that would take a long time and it may not be all that helpful. But it is useful to walk through the code and see how it tracks our methodology, see how it automates the methodology, and just generally how it works. So this is a long document. It's 18 pages. And I will say a couple things to begin with. First of all, this code was written in a way to make it easy to explain, so it can probably be done more efficiently and with shorter code than this. It's also full of comments explaining what's going on, and it's also a lot of statements that could have been written very short, in a very short fashion, were actually written in a longer fashion that made it easier to explain what various queries were doing. So the fact that this is long is mostly a result of the fact that it was put together in a way to be helpful. There's really not a whole lot of code here, to be honest with you. So basically, this was written in SQL, and the approach was to use what's called SQL procedures. For those of you who have not worked with SQL or programming, procedures basically allow you to put together sort of a self-contained chunk of programming code or queries that accomplish a particular task. And this is useful if you're going through a multi-stage process that involves doing the same tasks or similar tasks over and over again. It's much easier to conceptualize the logic of what's going on. Sometimes if you make things sort of self-contained procedures. So if you go to the top of the first page, you'll see that I created a procedure called Procedure Do Ownership Analysis. This is the big procedure that basically contains the logic for the whole methodology and approach. And what it does is it runs through the various steps of the methodology so that we can ultimately come to an answer regarding station ownership here. let's go through the procedures one by one. So the first one, line 10, I talk about it. Declare variables and create initial tables needed for analysis. And I called that procedure setup. And that procedure starts page 2, line 70. Another way that this code is a little longer than it needs to be is made the decision to declare a lot of variables because it allowed the queries to be written in a way that was very easy to understand. You could write this whole code probably declaring much fewer variables, and the queries just get a little more complicated and hard to understand. So again, that was a decision I made. So what does this code do? Starting at line 81, we're declaring a bunch of variables. We've got several processes going along here. The code's got to ultimately classify station ownership, and that's what the first two variables are involved in. And then it's got to churn through the reports the way we did it under our methodology, and that's what this next set of variables does. It starts at 89. And then it has to go through the interest holders on reports. And that's sort of what the variables that start at 102 and go to 114 do. But in general, when you think about it, that's really how the methodology works. You start with a list of stations, and then you go through their reports. And while you're going through their reports, you go through the interest holders on the reports. That's how it goes. So that's sort of the steps of the methodology. And then what else do we do? We at line 133, I created a table called Table Stations Reduced. This is where we cut down the data set to just include the stations that might be Asian owned, based on the fact that they disclosed at least one person who was racially Asian who had a voting share. So we could go through that query real quick, starting at 136. We're selecting distinct facility IDs from the ownership group. That's the table that contains the stations based on this earlier ownership chart. We interjoined it on ownership structure, which is the chart that contains the interest holder information. And we've linked the unique, the primary keys there. Application ID for the ownership structure is linked to main application ID and ownership group. We talked about that earlier. And here's where we do the cut, top of the next page, where ownership structure votes percentage, that's the voting percentage that an interest holder reports, is greater than 0. That means they have some votes. And the race Asian flag is checked. So that's, is there one person Asian with votes? And then the next two, the and ownership group file prefix, I think we know what that is. That's pulling out the biennials. And then the app ARN 2013-2014, that's pulling out the last round of biennials. There are times when people get late filed on their biennials, so I just picked up 2014. If it's a 2014 biennial, it's meant for the 2013. And then, of course, we picked out the TV stations, TV or DT. Those are what categories they might be in. And I ordered it by facility ID. So this creates a table of all the stations, 34, that we are going to even bother analyzing. And then after that, I added a column to that table that is going to allow us to add the ownership category for each station as we figure it out. So
this is what it looks like.
Yeah. So when we create that table, it looks like this. It's a bunch of facility IDs. It's a table of ownership category, and nothing's in there yet because we haven't figured anything out. Okay. Starting at 166, and I won't go into this in as much detail, but since we know what stations we care about, we know what records we need to pull from ownership group, ownership report, and ownership structure to do the analysis. And so that's what the next three queries do. Ownership group reduced, we select everything from ownership group, but we interjoin it now to the reduced table station table we created. We use sort of the same criteria, and what this query does basically is it pulls everything out of ownership group for those stations. On the next page, the query there does the same thing for the ownership report table. And then the next query down, starting at line 202, does the same thing for the ownership structure table. So basically, those are three very similar queries that say we know what stations we care about. Just pull the ownership report database records we care about. And note that we're not pulling anything else. We don't care about any of the other ownership report tables because none of those tables have any information that are relevant to the analysis we're doing. That's a very, very large cut at the data from the get-go. And especially limiting the number of stations you even have to think about, that is a real time saver from the beginning. What do we do next? I create a table called table analysis. That table is the chart from the methodology where you add the lines for the reports and the interest holders. And you'll see that for the most part, the fields I have added to the table are mimic and parallel the fields in the charts we used. We have the facility ID, a report ID, and we have the file number, the FRN, and the name. The type field there is whether it's a person or an entity. The appears ID keeps track of what report they appear on. You got the race and the reported votes, and we're going to calculate the votes. That's the votes real. We actually use the report chain to calculate what the votes really are. This analyzed field is just to check off to know that we've gone through that report. It's the done column. We put an X in it when we're done. And I added a field, a primary key sequencer. The reason I did that, and that's completely unnecessary for the analysis. We don't really need to see what table analysis looks like to get our answer. We just need it to be created. But I wanted, for purposes of just, being helpful and seeing how it works, I wanted at the end of this to have the whole table analysis created for all the stations so it could be looked at. We could see what it did. And this primary key, that basically allows it to sort by the order it's added. So that at the end of the day, we'll have the list of rows that are added to the table analysis as it was going.
I was just going to add, just in general, when you're writing complicated queries and programs, it's often really, really helpful to add intermediate output to take your steps in the middle and display them so that you can go back and look and see, make sure, one, that everything is running correctly and help you find any problems that have cropped up.
Right.
Yeah.
And an interesting thing about databases is they don't inherently have an order to them unless you impose it. So when you're inserting rows into data tables, it's not like a spreadsheet where you're just always adding at the end. And so if I didn't have this primary key sequencing it, I would have table analysis, but it would be in all sorts of a strange order because it doesn't really track that.
Right, and the other interesting thing about databases is sometimes you don't end up with unique rows, and if you're looking for a particular thing and there's multiple copies of that same thing in there, you'll get all of them in return, and if you haven't set up your program to handle that correctly, and this is another way of making sure that everything is unique.
Right. So, again, completely unnecessary for our analysis to retain that table, but I thought it'd be neat at the end to see what table analysis looked like, so I created that little wrinkle. He talked about creating intermediate steps of your code. The next page is a good example of that. For the part of the methodology where we're adding interest holders for the various reports, the way I did that was I created a temporary table that had a lot of information in it, and then I churned through that to add the records to table analysis. I didn't have to do it that way. It ended up being a lot easier to code it that way. And that's a great example of, especially here where quite frankly, for something like this, speed and efficiency was not necessarily at a premium. I just decided to do this intermediate step to make it easier to code and explain. And so that's that procedure. So we start going back to it. Actually, maybe at this point, it may be useful to just sort of take off pages 1 and 2 so you can sort of have them separate because we're going to step through the procedure. It's easier than flipping back and forth. So we just talked about procedure setup, which is what was on line 12 there. The next step of the big procedure do ownership analysis says determine number of facilities remaining to analyze. So we just want to churn through every facility that we think we need to consider. So I want to count the remaining facilities. Well, what are the remaining facilities? If you look, well, we have 34 rows in table analysis, and right now they're all null, have no value in them. So that 34. Any row in table stations reduced that has a facility ID and no ownership category is what remains to be analyzed. So if you go to page 6, line 254, that's the procedure that counts the number of stations to be analyzed, and it's very simple. There's a variable facilities remaining. Select count star, that means count the number of records from table stations reduced where ownership category is null. How many records are there in table stations reduced where we haven't had an ownership categorization? And that's all that procedure does. It's literally a one-line procedure. We have to call that several different times in the methodology, so it's useful to isolate it, but it's a very short procedure. The next one is short as well. Once we know how many facilities we have left to analyze, we want to know which is the next one we need to analyze. Well, that'll be the first record in table station reduced that has no ownership category yet. So we have a variable current facility where we select the facility ID from table stations reduced where ownership category is null, limit 1. Limit 1 is something you'll see pop up a lot in SQL queries and within this code. And that basically says if you're running a query that's going to return multiple results, you just want one of them. Here, if we just said select facility ID from table stations reduced where ownership category is null, that would return 34 stations. It wouldn't help us set the next one. So run the query and find the first one. That's the next facility. And that's the end of that procedure, which is very simple. So going back to page 1 here with the procedure, we've gone through procedure, count remaining facilities, and getting the next facility is part of the loop for going through all the facilities. So line 18 there, you see the comment says, go through the facilities until there are no more left to analyze. And the way we implemented this was with something that's called a while loop, which is something that exists in most sort of programming languages. And it basically allows you to do a block of code, execute a block of code until a certain condition is no longer true. So here, it was while at variable facilities remaining is greater than 0. So I think it's fairly clear what's going on there. That variable facilities remaining, that's when we're counting how many facilities in the chart we still need to look at. If we run that query and we said there are no more left, then we're done going through the facilities. So that's a while loop that basically says go through the facilities until there aren't any more. And what do you do in that loop? You find the next facility to analyze. That was the procedure get next facility that we just talked about. Now, in our analysis, we started with the licensee report because that's sort of the bedrock of churning through the reports. So it's not surprising that the next procedure is called procedure add licensee report. And that procedure starts at the top of page 7 at line 283. And this is a procedure that's fairly long, and I'm not going to go through it all, but I'll explain basically what's going on. The first thing we need to do is find the licensee report. Now, as you likely remember from our earlier conversation, each ownership report is identified by a unique application ID and table report. So that's what we're searching for. So we set variable application ID, starting at line 293 here, and we select from table ownership report reduced, which is our smaller version of it, the application ID. We interjoin that on ownership group reduced on the facility ID, and we find where the record and table ownership group reduced, the facility ID in that record is the current facility we're looking at. So we're trying to find the record for our facility, and then we look for where table ownership report reduced dot respondent nature flag is licensee. There's a field in table ownership report that tracks that checkbox where you say, are you a respondent or an entity with an attributable interest? So are you a licensee or an entity with attributable interest? And we want to have that field be licensee. What we're basically saying is find the application ID for the report for the facility we're looking at right now, filed for the licensee. And we get that application ID, and we're off to the races.
It should just be one of those reports per station.
One of those reports per station. But the limit 1 is necessary because you'll pull several records out of the table ownership group reduced. So you still limit it to 1, but there's only one licensee report. If you didn't limit this to 1, you would get a bunch of records that had the same application ID. So this just makes sure you get 1. And then what do we do from here? We set a bunch of variables that are necessary to write the record we need to the analysis table. So on 309, we get the main file number for the report. 318, we get the ownership structure ID, which helps us get some of the information out of table ownership structure. We get the name, line 330, we get the FRN. And then there's a slight wrinkle here that's not all that complicated, but is worth going into. Remember how I said that only entities file ownership reports unless you have a sole proprietor licensee? This next bit of code just addresses the sole proprietor licensee situation. So we look, line 357, we look in this query basically from line 357 to line 368, that if-then clause is basically, that if clause is saying, did they check the box on the report saying they were a sole proprietor? If they did, then we set the type variable to P, that's because it's a person. We set the analyzed variable, which is the done category, to yes, because we don't have to do anything more for a person record through our methodology. We set the report ID to null because we don't assign a report ID to a person record. If it's not a sole proprietorship, then it's an entity. And so we set the type variable to E because it's an entity. We set the analyzed variable to no because that flags that we need to look at that report. And we set the report ID to 1 because we're at the licensee stage and that's the first report. And then, after that, on the next page, this is all about tracking whether the reported party is racially Asian. So if the variable type is P, if it's a person, then we look to see if the ownership, if the Asian race checkbox was checked. If it is, then on line 395 we set our variable race Asian to yes. Otherwise we set it to no. So basically the first if is saying if it's a person and they've checked the box, then it's yes. If not, then it's no. And so that the not covers the person who hasn't checked the box. It also covers an entity, which set it to no. And then, once we've set all of those variables, we can insert a new row, the first row into table analysis based on those variables. And all that this next complicated looking piece of code does is it takes the first part that corresponds to the fields in table analysis, the columns. It says insert a record into table analysis into these fields, insert these values, and then it relies on the variables we set. A couple of them don't rely on the variables we set, and those are pretty easy to figure out. 429, that's the value that we're writing to the appears ID field, which identifies what report this entity appeared on. If it's a licensee report, that's just null, basically. And the 100%, that's just corresponds to what we did in our methodology where we said the licensee has 100% of its own votes. We didn't have to set those to variables because those are always the same. And then that's the end of that procedure. So if we go back to the first pages here where we're stepping through the analysis procedure, we've added the record for the licensee report to the table. And then the next step is we need to churn through any additional reports that there are. And there may not be any, right? If it's a sole proprietor licensee, or if it's a licensee that had only people owning it, there may not be any more reports. So we need to determine if there are more reports to analyze. So I have a procedure for that. It says procedure count remaining reports. I tried to give these fairly transparent names. This is another one of those short procedures. It starts on line 440. Counts the number of reports that still need to be analyzed. And 448, the code, it says set the variable reports remaining. That's how we're tracking this information. Is select count from table analysis where facility ID equals current facility. So it's a report for the station we're thinking about right now. Type equals E. It's an entity. And analyzed equals no. So that basically means look for any rows that identify entities and have not been analyzed yet. So that's finding any reports that we haven't gone through yet. And you get a count. So it's a select count statement, so you'll get a number back. So after in our procedure, we've counted the remaining reports. And then after that, we go into another while loop that is allowing you to sort of execute a block of code until a condition fails. Here it's while at variable reports remaining greater than 0. So what we're saying here is we want you to execute this block of code until there are no more reports to analyze. And what do we do next? If we're in this loop, we know we have reports remaining, so we want to find the next report. That's a fairly simple thing to do. That procedure, called procedure get next report, starts on line 455. And basically it sets one variable. Well, it actually sets a couple of variables. The first thing it wants to find is the report ID. The report ID is the number that we've assigned to that report in our analysis table. So we're basically looking for the first number of a report that we haven't analyzed yet. So look in table analysis for a report for our facility where the type is an entity, and then if you go to the next page, and table analysis analyzed equals no, limit 1. So this is sort of like that facility query to find the next facility. This is look at table analysis and find the next report we haven't analyzed yet. And then when we found that report, we can set the we can find the application ID for that report, and we can find we get the variable. We set the variable that tracks the number of votes represented by that report. That's for the later calculations. So that's just 3 very quick queries of table analysis that gets us the information we need to go to the next report. So going back to the big procedure, well, once you found a report, we know in our methodology the next thing you do is you're going to list out all the interest holders on that report. So I have a procedure called get interest holders, and that procedure does exactly what we probably think it does. This is where I used a temporary table to accomplish it, but the goal of this procedure is to basically put records into table analysis for all the interest holders on the report you're looking at. So the first step here was I created this temporary table interest holder, where you pull out values from table ownership structure reduced, and the where clause says where the table ownership structure reduced application ID is our variable application ID, so basically records associated with the application we're looking at, the report we're looking at, where the votes percentage is greater than 0, right, because for this we only care about voting interest holders, and table ownership structure reduced dot listing type flag is not equal to R. That is, if you go back to when we turned through the reports, remember how when we were going to the 3A records, we always said the first record is for the respondent to show you where you're starting from? This basically disregards that record because we don't need it for the analysis. That's just, it restates who the respondent on that report is, so we don't need that record, so we don't look at it. So this puts into a temporary table basically information about all the interest holders on the report that we care about, the ones that have votes and are not the respondent. That's get the interest holders. You go back to the main procedure. What do we do after we get the interest holders? We call a procedure called add interest holders. And this one's fairly complicated and is not one that I want to go through in detail and sort of bore you with. But basically, it does something very similar to what we did when we wrote the licensee report record to table analysis. It sets a bunch of variables that are needed to fill in the record for the interest holder. So we have the interest holder ID, we've got this FRN, we get the name. Turning over to page 14, we get the reported votes. And this next line, line 608, is worth going into in some detail, although I think it's fairly obvious what it does. We've just polled the reported votes for the interest holder, right? But we need to know what those votes represent, and that's what I have captured with interest holder votes real. What you take is the second one there is variable interest holder votes reported. That's what we just set. That's the reported votes. And then we had this at variable report votes. We set that in another procedure. That's the votes that are represented by the report we're looking at. So basically this does the calculation where you multiply the reported votes times the votes on the report to figure out what voting interest is actually represented by the row you're adding to the table. And the dividing by 100 is just because you multiply two percentages by two double-digit numbers, and you get, if you don't divide it by 100, it's not a percentage. So figured that out the hard way. I was wondering why the code wasn't running, and then I realized that I'd forgotten to do that. And then if you move on from that, we set the interest holder type to entity or person based on what's in the table. And this is a lot like code we've already seen. If it's a person and they've checked the box indicating that they're Asian, then we set the Asian flag to yes. If otherwise, we set it to no. Then we just pull. Oh, this is where. Sorry, this got confused for a second. We need to give it the next number in our analysis table, right? So if we have written records for 4 reports to the analysis table, we're going to add another one. We want to call that number 5. All this code does is figure that out. So it looks at looks at table analysis and looks what's the largest report ID in that table right now, and then you add 1 to it to write the next record. So that just ensures that you give the next record in table analysis the next sequential number. And then again, if you got a person going through the code, if you're writing a record to the table for a person, you set the analyzed field to yes because you don't have to do anything more. If not, you set it to no because that's the flag you've got another report to look at. And then if you've got a person, you don't need to set the application ID field because you're not getting an application. Otherwise, you do want to know what the application ID for the report is so you can pull it later, and that's what that does. And if it's a person, line 699 on page 16, we don't figure out a report main file number because we don't have a report to pull. If it's not a person, then we want to find the main file number for the report for that entity and put it in the table, so that pulls that. And then again, so once we've set all those variables, we can insert another row into the analysis table. And this looks a lot like the code in that last procedure we looked at, where you just lay out the fields and you use the variables to set their values. So basically what this code does is it allows you to write a record for each interest holder that you've identified, that identifies if it's a person or an entity, gives the report information, the vote information, lets you know if you need to churn through another report based on that, and writes the row and then goes through. And then sort of after we've written the record, we update table interest holders, that's our temporary table, to say we've taken care of that interest holder. And we subtract 1 from our count of remaining interest holders, and then we go back to the beginning of this procedure, and we just keep looping through the interest holders until we're done. By the time this procedure is done, we have added rows to table analysis for every interest holder for the report.
And that finishes 1 station's worth of interest holders.
That finishes the interest holders on 1 report for a station, and then you got to go through and find the rest. And so if you go to page 2 of the big procedure here, what's the next procedure we call? Count remaining reports. that is the same procedure we counted at the beginning to figure out how many reports we needed to analyze. But here is the difference between the counts that we're running here. When we're counting facilities to analyze, we have a finite list of facilities. We're really just going through them one by one. When you're counting remaining reports, it's different in that every time you add interest holders to reports, to table analysis, you may be adding more reports that you need to analyze. So, for example, if you just had you may have one report remaining on table analysis when you start, but then you would analyze that report, and that report might show 3 or 4 entities that are interest holders themselves that have reports. And so you would end up with, in fact, more reports remaining to go. So here it really is important that every time you count the facilities, you count the reports remaining, you look at the analysis table and see what's there. You can't just count down here because it's a sort of an organically growing and decreasing set of reports. Whereas when we're counting the facilities, it really is just 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. Okay, and then then we have end while. This ends the while loop where we're going through the reports. So here we counted the reports again, and we said end while. So you go back to the beginning of the while loop, which is line 20. It says you're doing this while variable. Sorry, not line 20. Line 36. You do this while variable reports remaining is greater than 0. So at some point you're going to be executing this while loop, and you're going to call this procedure count remaining reports, and it's going to say there are no reports remaining. And then you get to the beginning of the while loop, and it'll say do this while the reports remaining is greater than 0. And the while loop's condition will have failed, and you will stop doing that while loop. Okay? And once we've done that, we know that we've added all the rows we need to the analysis table. So what do we do next? We call this procedure called categorize ownership. And that procedure starts top of page 18, line 780. This is a fairly simple piece of code. Look at line 789. If select sum table analysis votes real from table analysis, where the where clause says for people who have checked the Asian race box and rows that are associated with the current facility that we're looking at, if you take all those votes and sum them up, if that number is greater than 50, then we update table station reduced, our list of table of stations. We set its ownership category to Asian owned. So basically what we're saying here is if you look at table analysis and the votes for Asian individuals is greater than 50, we're going to call this an Asian owned station. Otherwise, we're going to call it a not Asian owned station. So that's a fairly simple piece of code. It just does some math on the table, updates table stations reduced, and that's it. And then we go back to the big procedure here. Once we've categorized the ownership, on line 62, we call the procedure to count remaining facilities. So we go back to table analysis and say, okay, now how many facilities do we have left? Now, if we've done this once, now it's 33. We'll keep counting that down. Eventually, we'll get to the point where we will call that procedure and it will turn 0. At that point, you'll go back to the top of the while loop on page 20, which says while variable facilities remaining is greater than 0, do this. That condition fails, and you're done with that while loop. And that's it. And since I have put everything in procedures, if you go to page 18 at the bottom, the comment 820 says, now that all the procedures are defined, this code starts the analysis. And literally the code is 2 lines. We do that set SQL safe updates. We talked about that earlier. That just allows you to do it. And then I call the big procedure, do ownership analysis.
All right.
And it churns through everything.
Let's do it.
And it does it with surprising speed.
Yeah.
Even to me, surprising speed.
Takes about a minute.
We're just doing this to show you that it's quick. I know you're waiting now, but you're not going to wait long.
Have some jeopardy in the effect.
That's
Yeah.
right. That's
You know,
about 60 seconds.
it's
yeah.
funny, joking about this, I was thinking we wouldn't do this during the workshop because at home it took 5 minutes. I think I need a computer upgrade at my house because it's much quicker here. And it's done.
There it is.
And so what do we have? What we really care about is table stations reduced. What does that look like now? And you'll see it's gone through all the stations and it's categorized them as Asian owned or not Asian owned. And if you look at table analysis, remember how I set this up to keep track of table analysis? Instead of doing one table analysis for each station, I just appended it, and it's long. How many rows is it? 824 rows. So if you did this manually, you would have done 824 rows of manual analysis, which would have taken you probably a week. And this code does it in a minute.
We don't have that code.
It is on GitHub. It is up there now. Yep. So I know that was fast, and maybe just real quick, it's worth just one more quick run through the logic, not the code, but the logic. So again, you begin on page 1. You set everything up at line 12. Line 16, you just count the facilities. You got a big while loop that churns through all the facilities by going to the next one, adding the licensee report, counting the remaining reports, and then churning through all the reports and interest holders until there aren't any more. Once it gets there, we categorize the ownership, we count the remaining facilities, and we start again. And that's basically, if you think about it, that's just our methodology that we went through by hand with the table. It really wasn't that hard to implement. And this is a great example of, the kind of thing you can do with big data. If you can figure out a way, and usually can, to take something that looks complicated and boil it down to very simple steps that are easy to automate and that can be, repeated, and if you can figure out the logic of it, you can do pretty amazing things pretty quickly. I don't know if this is all that amazing, but it did solve something, and I think that's worthwhile. Let's go to the next slide. Any questions about that? Was that clear? I didn't go through the nuts and bolts of the queries, but I think probably, if you're familiar with SQL, it's probably very easy to figure out what the queries did. If you're still sort of learning SQL, it's probably better served to just look at them afterwards and piece them together and figure out what they do. But it's pretty clear.
Certainly a good example of, if you can imagine yourself writing out a table as you go through this process to help keep track, how you can automate that. You can write queries that fill in those blanks on that table for you and do the same process, just faster.
Yeah. Absolutely. So next slide, I've covered some of this already. So looked at more than 350 reports, 800 rows, took about a minute to run. I told you that we were going to run into those Sagamore Hill stations with the complicated ownership structure again. By a sheer coincidence, those stations ended up being on the table of stations to start with. I didn't plan for that, but it happened. So we ended up having to analyze those to figure it out. It was sort of annoying because, in fact, they're not Asian-owned. There's just somebody way up the chain who has a tiny voting interest that ends up pulling them into the list. Each one of those stations required 80 rows in and of themselves to analyze. So that's a really good reason to automate that, because nobody wants to go through that ownership structure by hand if they can avoid it. And this is sort of an even more important point. This methodology that the code uses, we solved a specific problem with it here, but it's a methodology that can be flexibly used for other things. We could be tracking other racial categories. We could be tracking ethnic categories, Hispanic, Latino, not Hispanic, Latino, female ownership interests. If we weren't interested in votes, we could capture officers and directors. And you can see how you could modify this methodology to find all the officers and directors and what race, gender, ethnicity categories they're in, and even what entities they're officers and directors of. Or any other thing you could think about, you could really do with this methodology, and it just really depends on at the end of the day, it's what you end up putting into that analysis table, what you're tracking, that ends up making that go. But there's all, I can't even think of all the things you could do with this, but you can think of a lot of different ways to study the data this way. Okay. Are there any questions about that? That is something, again, I think if you sort of read through that after the workshop a little more, it'll become a little clearer what's going on. So that sort of ends the part of the program where we're talking about FCC data, using just FCC data.
Well, actually just the ownership data. We'll still be using some internal engineering data.
Oh, that's right. Okay, move on.
Well, great. So we went through this example with the Asian-owned stations. We showed you some automation. What if you wanted to pull in some additional data? So let's say you end up with some output. In this case, we have this output here for a particular set of stations based on the racial category. We've created another station table that we're going to work with for another few queries, which is going to be all racial minority-owned station, full-power stations.
From the last round, yeah.
From the last round. And so you actually have that as well. It was part of the data in the data repository.
Yeah, this is a good place to sort of explain something. We distinguished earlier between data and analysis of data, and I talked about sort of the FCC. We do an ownership report summary analysis every 2 years. We got this table here. That was generated from one of the attachments from that study. So even though that was an analysis of the data, it concluded basically a data table that could be used for further study. So sometimes, and this is a great example as well, when you do an analysis of data, you're not just reaching conclusions. Sometimes you're actually creating another table that can be used to answer the next question. And this was a great example of that. Our analysis for that summary report created this table, and I was thankful that this was true. There's Asian-owned stations on it, and that list matches my list exactly except for one station. And the one station that doesn't match, if you go back to the other table, is this one at the very end. Scroll to the very end. No, the very end of the whole thing. That one I picked up as well in my analysis because under my analysis I was just looking to see if the box for Asian was checked, and it was. But for this station, it looks like the people checked 2 race boxes, and this analysis put them in the 2 or more races category.
WJYS?
Yeah, which is fine. It basically means that we pulled the same stations, which is good.
32334. 32334.
Yep.
There it is.
So, yep.
So let's say this is our starting point, and we want to do a number of things. Let's say we want to pull in some engineering data. Maybe we want to know the transmitter coordinates for the station to eventually map it. If we want to map this to the transmitter location, if we want to find out its a service contour, if we want to pull in demographic information from the county that it's in or the metropolitan statistical area that it's in, so one place to start is pulling in some engineering data, and this is actually internal FCC data. This isn't ownership data, but again, it's in CDBS, and we can show you a very simple linkage. Let me zoom in on it. So we're now really familiar with our ownership report table, ownership group table. There's this additional table here which houses all of the engineering data. And you can actually link to it in a number of different ways. We've showed you sort of 2 linkages that you can do here. One is it's actually there is a facility ID. The facility ID doesn't uniquely identify this table because, first of all, there's going to be some coordinates that may, there's a sort of historic list of station coordinates, for example, or station characteristics based on when it was last updated or when they last submitted a change in application. And that's all going to be in this table, and it'll be by facility ID, but it's not, they'll have multiple entries for any given facility. It's actually uniquely identified by application ID. And so you can link from the ownership tables to the engineering data on facility, but it's not going to be a one-to-one linkage. It's going to be sort of multiple observations here linked to multiple observations based on the facility of the station. And you can also link to it based on the application ID if you're specifically looking for maybe the most recent one. And so one thing that we were interested in doing, we can show you the query for it.
One point of clarification in there is that the application ID that's in a ownership biennial or otherwise an ownership filing is not going to be the same as an application ID that shows up in the engineering data. So because CDBS is tracking all of the applications that stations submit, not just the 323, but when they're doing a construction permit or a modification of license or any number of other technical or any sort of filing, CDBS keeps track of that as an application ID. And so you won't find the main application ID from ownership group in the TV engineering data because engineering data is not part of an ownership filing. So I just wanted to clarify that when we were talking about linkages by application ID.
And what you're really doing in this query is you're finding the most recent application where the station set forth its technical specifications.
Right.
That's really what you're finding here. The most recent application ID in TV engineering data, that's telling you what did they most recently tell us their engineering specs were. And the engineering specs include coordinates, where the station is located.
So let's say we want to do that first. Actually, I did something. I'll get back to this. This is actually a really cool and very short piece of code that I'll get to in a minute. But let's start with station coordinates. And so we created this table called minority mapping. And so as we frequently do, we start with a select statement. And if you're confused by the prefixes here, it's because one thing you can do in SQL is you can basically, if you're getting annoyed of either copy pasting or typing, the name of the table as the prefix for any kind of category that you're trying to include, you can rename it something. Well, not necessarily rename it, but sort of index that table with something shorthand like MO, for example.
Give it a nickname.
Give it a nickname, exactly. And so that's what I've done here. So MO refers to minority owned and understands that because in the from statement where I have minority owned, I follow it up with what the nickname is. And so what do we want to pull out? We want to pull out DMS coordinates. That stands for degree minute second. That's very frequently how mapping software or GIS software likes data input in that way. And so we have that data in our engineering tables. So we're interested in, for example, for latitude and longitude, we want the degree, the minute, the second, and the direction, which is going to be north, given that's the hemisphere we're on. And for longitude, degree, minute, second, and direction, which is going to be west, again, western hemisphere.
Are people familiar with seeing coordinates in this way? And this is not sort of a unique FCC thing. This is just a precise way of doing it, just 3 sets of numbers.
Right. This little thing right here, this min site number, I didn't put this in at first, and I actually had a few duplicate coordinates, actually duplicate observations for a particular facility with slightly differing coordinates, and that's because of something sort of archaic where certain stations are categorized as DTS.
That's not even archaic. That's actually new.
That's actually
that's right.
So
yeah.
there's in the recent few years, there's been a development called DTS, Distributed Transmission Systems, where a single station can have multiple transmit sites spread out throughout its service area, each a smaller version of that station, and they all transmit. So it's rather than relying on a single, one powerful transmitter tower where it might be blocked by a mountain or a building or something, now you can get a signal from multiple directions and
it's like a cell phone network for a
fill in the
TV
holes.
station.
And it's able to fill in the holes.
And it was big in, not many stations are doing this, but certain places it was worthwhile. I think Puerto Rico was a place where the topography made sense to do it this way. I mean, it's more expensive, obviously,
Yeah.
but if it makes sense in certain circumstances, they do it. So,
There's a station.
so in any event,
Penn
he was
State.
finding duplicate records because there were more than one tower.
Yeah, there's very few. I think for full power stations, there's a handful, maybe 10 or 15 all told.
There aren't that many of them right now.
And we were picking up maybe 2 or 3 of them in our list of minority-owned stations that we were running this query on. So basically, to get the correct reference coordinates, you basically need to take the minimum of the site number. That's sort of in the engineering data table.
And that is because the first listing of coordinates in the engineering table is actually the reference coordinate as if the station had one transmitter.
Right.
So that pulls up that kind of sometimes imaginary location, but often there actually is a real transmitter there as well.
Yep.
That was just an odd little wrinkle we found.
Yeah. And so you're doing that. So this is the stuff you want. You want it, and obviously you want this for every station in your list of minority-owned stations. So you select it from the minority-owned station table. You join it to your engineering data table on facility ID, as we showed in the sort of in the linkage. And then what Jake was mentioning earlier is we really only want the most recent coordinates. And we get that by looking for the maximum application because, as he mentioned, the application ID, it's ordinal in that the larger numbers corresponds to the most recent filings, and those are the ones for which we want the coordinates. And we also limited by the application type. We want L or ML, so L is sort of a license to cover. It indicates to us that they filed an application with sort of site coordinates for the transmitter. Or ML could be a modification of the license, and this could be a small modification, but it could also, in these modifications, they could also have a change in coordinates for one reason or another. So we want to make sure that we're looking for these two types. And that's what basically we want. We find this the maximum application, and we join this to our engineering data on the facility ID. And if we run this, it's going to run. And there's no output at this second because I created a new table, but it'll tell me right here 41 rows affected. So before we do anything else, let's see what it looks like. And here it is. So we have our basically, so everything up till here is just that minority-owned table that we had previously. And then everything to the right comes from the engineering data. These are the latitude, degree, minute, second, north, degree, minute, second, west. Here's the site number. It's usually 0. And this just sort of tells you when they most recently updated their coordinates. And so one cool thing you can do is if you're looking to, if you're familiar with GIS and you're looking to export some of this into GIS, you can basically concatenate this to make it look like a real latitude and longitude coordinates. And the way you do this is simple alter table command. I added a column called latitude. I also added a column called longitude. And in that, it's basically updating our minority mapping table. And you set latitude as the concatenation of degree. Then you add a little degree sign, the minute sign, second, and then direction. And so I'll show you what this does. And here it is, the last two columns.
The point there being that, GIS software, which is complicated and there's a lot of variety, they just like to see data in different ways. It turned out the GIS software that we used, it didn't like seeing the degrees, minute, and seconds in separate fields. It liked seeing the data like that. So we just wrote a query that put the data like that.
Yep.
And sometimes you might find software that wants it in decimal degrees, where you would do a little bit of math and there's 60 minutes in a degree and 60 seconds in a minute, and you can do a little bit of math and calculate out to where it would be 17.6 whatever, a single number decimal.
In situation, yeah.
It depends on the situation and the software that you're trying to connect this into.
But when you figure that out, there's usually some way in SQL to do a little math or concatenation
Exactly.
or something like that to get it where you need it to be. You had a question, sir?
No, so I was going to say, so this shows us a couple of ways that we can pull data from multiple places, put it together, cross-pollinate, come up with this. For this in particular, though, can you give us maybe a suggestion of what this application might do for you? So you've got a group of stations you know to be Asian-owned. You now know where they are geographically. You've got them in long latitude format, which we export to GIS or to another program. Could you then take that information, take those coordinates and map them somewhere? Could you overlay them
Yeah.
markets? Your earlier question as to how
We're going to talk a little bit about that. But, I mean, the answer is yes. I mean, once you've got coordinates, you know, there's
Yeah.
no. Really.
Well, that's absolutely fair.
Shows you're thinking.
following the progression.
Yeah, but yeah, aside from the obvious, which is you can make a map that's pretty, which we're going to cover a little bit later. There are definitely mechanisms to map coordinates to various things. Basically, the sky's the limit. You just got to find the mapping. But once you know where you are, you can probably find a county. Maybe you can get from a county to a DMA
And
if you've got the right.
And that's
data
exactly
rights.
one of the things we're going to show
Yeah,
is
we'll do a little
take
bit of
two
that.
data sources, try to figure out what is common between them and how to connect to them, and maybe do a little bit of data manipulation in between to try to do that.
Yeah.
And so before we actually get to that, there's one more thing that we wanted to highlight when it came to sort of the inputs that are eventually going to be used for something like mapping. And so, you know, we just pulled in the reference coordinates, and we'll show you how we can map those a little bit later. Another thing we can do is use something called a KML file, which stands for Keyhole Markup Language. And it was actually, I believe it was developed by Google specifically for their geographic software, so for their Google Maps and Google Earth. And what it does is it basically contains, it's a file format. It basically specifies features, whether it's sort of polygons or images or placeholders that you can then display on Google Maps. And the FCC actually houses these things that we call KML files on an internal site that has sort of the same URL that only varies by the facility ID. And so the URL is the following. I'm highlighting it right here. It's http://data.fcc.gov/media bureau v01 TV contour facility, and then, you know, and then it's actually whatever the facility ID is of the station you're interested in, followed by .kml.
And those files, geographically, what they represent is the service contour of a station, which is basically on a map. Where does its signal go? How far does it go? Who does it serve over the air?
All right, and so let's say you want to download those files, and we'll later show you what you can do once you've downloaded them. It literally takes 5 seconds to take one of those files, integrate it into My Maps environment in Google Maps, and get the sort of transmitter location and service contour of the station. And so if you want to put that into a database, into your data table, for example, for the minority-owned stations that you're working with, you would add this column called KML URL, and you update it with this very basic concatenation, similar to what we did earlier, where you put in the part of the hyperlink that doesn't change, which is going to be in quotes to indicate that it's a string, then put in the actual facility ID from the table, and then end with .kml. And so we'll show you what that does. And here it is. You can see that this is exactly the hyperlink. You can basically do copy and paste into Internet Explorer, into Chrome or whatever, and you hit enter, and it's going to basically just download that KML file because that's where it's housed in our servers. And you can see that it varies by the facility ID of each of these stations.
Well, and, you know, it's interesting that the last two queries that you ran, I mean, we've talked about all this complicated SQL of linking to a bunch of tables and inner joins and selects and wheres. The last two queries that you ran didn't pull in any data from anywhere else but the table you already had. And that's sort of, I think, a feature of these database manipulation tools like SQL that people often don't think about, is, you know, the ability to use them to just take the data you've got and put it in a form that is more useful to you, or do something with it that makes it digestible by another program, by another process, in a report or whatever. And so these examples of making the coordinates digestible for the GIS and getting these links based on sort of a standard string URL. It's a great example of using SQL really not to almost create data out of the data you have, rather than pull in somebody else's data.
And again, when we post the presentation, you know, I think it's the very next slide. Right here, it's exactly what we just discussed. And so there's all the information for you to be able to go in and do the same thing, pull in the KML files, save them to your computer, and then later on we'll show how you can use them literally in 5 minutes to come up with a pretty cool looking map. And so I think the next thing that we were...
Is this after the break, right?
Is it? Well,
Are we at the break now? Yeah. So
are there any questions, by the way?
Yeah, by the way, there's questions. Well, this is a natural place for a break because I jumped the gun earlier. This is, in fact, where we end the part of the program where we're talking about just using the FCC's data. And after the break, we're going to talk about pulling in data from other places and doing some fairly powerful things with it. So let's take a 15-minute break and be back at, I guess, 35 after or so.
If you want, you can just do the whole next section. Chat about what you can do with the demographics, how you pull them in. Yeah.
Sure,
cool.
Happy to. Hope you had a nice break. So as Jake mentioned, now we're going to start talking a little bit about how to connect information that comes out of CDBS into some other data sources. And one of the specific ones that we found interesting was, since we're looking at the demographic information about station ownership, how does that, how do we compare that to the demographic information of the population that those stations serve? And the commission itself doesn't pull in demographic information for the population served of a station, but other data sources, and we specifically look at the U.S. Census Bureau, they collect that information in great detail. While the FCC has our information about stations, obviously on a station level, we're looking at facilities. The Census Bureau is collecting it on a geographic basis, and they collect a whole slew of different geographies. Everything from, they're surveying individual people all the way up, and they aggregate it all the way up to the nation with blocks and block groups and tracts and counties and states and zip codes and voting districts and all sorts of other things, metropolitan statistical areas. They look at a lot of different geographies. And one of the things, so given that census information is by geography and FCC information is by facility, we have to create a crosswalk to connect the two. But we have some geographical information about the station. We have a point. We have the location of its transmitter. And there are other actual pieces of geographic information in CDBS about stations. We were talking about the community of license. There's actually an address for the business address for the station, which is often in a completely different city than where the station is serving, but it's another piece of geographical information. But those are points, and we are looking at ways to tie into a larger geographical area. And we did a little bit of analysis based on counties, which in census terms are stored as a FIPS code. We also looked at metropolitan statistical areas. And if you jump right there. So there are a couple of resources available online. One is from the FCC itself, where you feed it a set of coordinates, and we saw earlier how we can get a set of coordinates from the TV engineering data and reformat it into something else. This particular URL that you can plug that into, it's the Census Block Conversions API hosted by the FCC. And if you feed that the set of coordinates in decimal format, it will return back to you a FIPS code. And among actually several other pieces of information, it'll actually write out the full county name and the state name, and even down to the census block that location is in. But we're really just interested in the FIPS code. And the Census Bureau also provides a really, really similar service that will return even more options of geographies. And it was all of the geographies that the Census Bureau cares about and measures by. And it's really, really powerful. And there's a description of how to use that API there. We won't go into the details here. But we bring this up because we used this to create a way of connecting a table of census information to the tables that we've created of the minority-owned stations. And at the bottom of this page, you can see a little code snippet there of how, and this is in the language Perl. I don't know how many of you use that programming language before, but it's meant to show just a really, really simple approach to automating for all of the thousands of stations, a way of pulling in that information from a URL, looking for a specific piece out of it, and storing it in a table that you can then bring into SQL and compare and connect to other tables. So here we have three tables: the minority-owned stations list that we created earlier, and this facility FIPS is what we've generated by using that API, where we plugged in the coordinates for each facility, and it returned a FIPS code. And then finally, we have a table of information that we got from the Census Bureau that by FIPS code, which corresponds to county, lists the demographic information of the people in there. It lists the total population of the county and the population by race and ethnicity of that county. And so you can do things like that by looking at, say, the county that the transmitter is in and comparing the ethnicity of the population served to the ownership of the station or something like that. You get to be creative here in what you want to do. But this is meant to just show as an example of taking those two different types of information, figuring out how to connect between them so that you can compare them to do some sort of study.
Yep. So, we've created this for you, and this has been part of the data dump that's in the data repository. And you can see right here, as we showed earlier, this is your typical A to B, B to C. And so we have our minority-owned table. And then next we have this facility FIPS sort of crosswalk that was created using that API. And here it is. It's very simple. It's just the two columns. It has the facility ID and the associated county FIPS code for every facility. And then we have the FIPS demographic table, which basically gives you, for the county FIPS code, the name, and as John mentioned, the total population, the population breakdown by race and ethnicity. Yep. And this is for the United States and all U.S. territories. So you'll see, Guam is in here.
American Samoa,
yep. And so if you wanted to run this query, it's actually a remarkably simple query. Let's go back to where we had it. This one right here. So let's say we've done it both for FIPS and MSA. Let's start with FIPS. So it's really simple. You just say, you select what you're interested in. Let's say you're starting with this, minority mapping table, which already has the transmitter coordinates in it that we had previously showed you how to pull in. And, you're pulling in things like the call sign. And now, from the crosswalk table, we want the facility ID and the FIPS code. And then from the actual demographic table, we want things like the racial category. Or actually, the race category comes from minority mapping. But from the demographic table, we just want everything, actually. So you're pulling in FIPS demographics .star, so that's sort of the catch-all. And then it's this very simple join, except for this time we've written it as a left join. And so we hadn't mentioned previously sort of the difference between an outer join and an inner join, or a left join, or rather an outer join like a left join and an inner join. An inner join is basically, if you imagine two intersecting circles, an inner join is everything that's sort of in between those two circles. And a left outer join would be everything in the middle plus everything in the left circle. So that basically says, in this case, it would mean that for our 41 or for our full power minority-owned stations, we want to make sure that all their information is in this final table no matter what. and then we pull in all the associated county information that's available. And in this case, everything's going to be available, but you'll see in the next example that when we were looking at MSA, we're going to have some missing values, and we'll talk about why that is briefly. But it's your simple, A to B, B to C, join the facility to the facility FIPS on the facility ID, and then you join to FIPS demographics, and you run it. And there you have it. So this is the the minority-owned table, or minority mapping table with the latitude and longitude, and then we've pulled in the county FIPS code, the FIPS name, and then all the associated demographic information. So you'll have here KUAM is a station in Guam. The ethnicity of the owner is Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, and then you can see that the county that the station services has a total population of about 160,000, of which about 80,000 are Pacific Islanders, 50,000 are of Asian race, and everything else there. And so that's one really easy way to pull in the demographic information. And so, as I mentioned, we've also done this for metropolitan statistical areas with the identical sort of methodology where we created a crosswalk table between the facility ID and the MSA. And then likewise, we created a MSA demographic table from the census website, which for each MSA has sort of the associated population counts. And in this case, we also included, or because that table happened to have the numbers as percentages. You can obviously create percentages on your own, but they had it to begin with, so we pulled that in as well. And so if you run that, it's essentially an identical query except for you're replacing FIPS with MSA. And here it is. And now we have the MSA information. However, you'll notice that if you decide to sort this by MSA, for example, you're going to get a bunch of null values. And that's because MSAs don't actually cover the entire United States. So these stations right here that have a null value for MSA and then obviously no associated demographic information are stations that are not their service, or rather their transmitter coordinates are not in an existing MSA. They're defined, they can be defined by county, they can be defined by, city, state, community, but not by MSA. And so that's why we have this missing data. But if you notice, when I was mentioning earlier the difference between sort of an inner join and a left outer join, an inner join wouldn't have pulled these observations at all, because it would have said, oh, well, there's missing data, we're not pulling that. Left outer join basically says, no matter what, I want everything for the facilities that are in our minority-owned list. And so the benefit of that is to see exactly what has and hasn't matched. And so it's easy to see that for this group of stations, there is no MSA information. So that's another really easy query you can do to pull in a lot of interesting data. And so,
and the geographies we chose were the MSA, obviously, which doesn't cover the entire country, is sort of the closest thing that the Census Bureau has to a DMA, showing the market area of a city. The Nielsen organizes DMAs by county, and so one of the reasons we chose county is one of the geographies that we were looking at is you could assemble all of the counties of a DMA into a file by that and aggregate them together. There could be a table in there that has the list of counties that are in a particular DMA, and that would be another table you could add to the crosswalk in there to aggregate that sort of information in there.
Yep.
But I think it's useful to sort of step back from the specific example and sort of take away the general point. I mean, we chose to use census data. We chose because it was interesting. It was interesting to match demographics to ownership. We chose to use a couple different geographies because we could pull those out fairly easily and teach you. But census, like us, has made their data available in a very generic format. So really, the sky's the limit in terms of what you can do.
That's
This
exactly
this is an example. There's lots of data sources out there. There's lots of questions, and benefit of having the data out there in this generic format on the FCC's website, on the Census Bureau's website, on countless other websites out there, is to not let other people's imaginations be a limitation on the kind of research and analysis that you can do. If you get the data and you think about what you want to study, and you can use some basic tools like SQL. We used a little Perl here. Simple tools that are pretty easy to learn. You can really do a lot of interesting things. And this is just one quick example to show you how it's done. But there's countless data sources out there and countless things you might want to study.
And speaking about interesting things you can do, part of the reason we wanted to create some of these data tables with coordinate locations, with these URLs to the Google KML files, is because we wanted to show you one additional thing you can do, which is actually map some of these things. And so, if Emily if you want to talk a little bit about some of the mapping and how we can visualize the stuff.
Sure. So you should have 3 maps.
Does anybody not
available.
have the maps?
So the first map that you're looking at was created in a. Should I not open it? This. Okay. The first map was created in a geographical information system program. I used QGIS, which is an open source program, but ArcGIS is also probably the most popular program you might be aware of. But
Oh, yeah, this is the.
okay.
Yeah, which is the first map. That's the Fox.
The Fox
Yeah, the Fox on station. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yeah. So the Fox zone stations, what you can do with a GIS program is bring in a data table that has all the information, both location or demographic, or in this case it had the call sign and the FAC ID associated, and you can put it on a map in any sort of in like counties, by zip code, by state. So for the Fox zone station map, I created it by the state, and you can just see the blue dots demonstrate the locations of all of the Fox-owned full power TV stations as of October 1st, 2013. And the second map, which is the Asian-owned full power TV stations, this was created using a similar type of process, but it also included the minority ownership identifier, and so these are all of the Asian-owned full power TV stations. And again, I used it on a state basis, but you can create it as far down as census blocks and tracts by streets. And using GIS software is very powerful because you could also include the demographic information. So then you could color coordinate the counties or the states by population that you get from census. So you could say, this county has 100,000 to 200,000 people, and that might be a certain color, and so the whole map can be color coded. So it's a really powerful tool. You can look at how far stations are from each other by location, by you can do different scaling. So I just made a very simple map to demonstrate where the stations are, and something that you can use. And then, as Eugene mentioned, you can also create a map in Google, and this is using the.
One moment. Oh, that's what I'm doing. For whatever reason, every time we go into presentation mode, when we get out of presentation mode, it disconnects us from the projector. It has to connect back in.
So using the KML file formats, you can create a map in Google. So here I just opened google.com/mymaps, and this is Google's version of type. It's not quite a GIS software, but it's kind of their version of it. So it's really quite simple. You just create a new map. And I previously downloaded the
It's like a different account.
okay.
So if you remember those URLs that we put into the data tables that had the link to the KML file, all you would do is you would literally go to that URL. A prompt would pop up to ask if you wanted to download that file. And so what Emily's done is she's actually just downloaded 2 of those files, and we'll show you they're sitting in our downloads folder.
So I just will quickly log on to my
Hide the screens.
But I'm going to show you how to create your own Google map. So the third map is a demonstration of one that I've already created, and I'm just going to walk through how I created this map. Once this works. Okay, so this is just the general interface of Google's mapping software. And as you can see, you can title your map in this area. You can add different layers. So it's a very simple GIS type of software. So the first thing that I do, just in terms of ease of use, is I change my base map so it's kind of one color and doesn't have necessarily all the names. So I usually go for the light political personally. And as you can see, it just changes the map, and so that it's kind of washed out. But so the first thing I did was I downloaded the census information for the MSA boundaries, and I've already downloaded that, but you can find that on the census website, and they have a number of different mapping file types, and so I use the KML file type, which you'd want to use. If you were using a GIS software, you'd want to download the shapefile type, which is it's SHP, that's the identifier. So if I just go into my downloads, which is here, you can see that this is the KML file for the MSA boundaries, and if I open it up, it'll lay the boundaries over the base map. It just takes a second to upload. Sorry for the delay.
Perhaps upgrade.
We're almost there.
It's stuck at 99. Maybe we shouldn't have said anything.
Okay.
Oh, there it goes.
That delay may have been related to our recent technology upgrades. We're not sure.
And you can save all of your maps in Google to your Google account, and it saves in your drive. And so I've saved this map previously, but once you save it, you can go in and change anything about the map. So you can add demographic information if you find that, or if you have other data you want to add. So as you can see, this shows all the MSAs, and as was mentioned earlier, there's not an MSA for the entire country, so you can see the areas of the United States that don't have an MSA available, and that's the null that Eugene was mentioning earlier. So it's quite easy just to change how this looks, and it makes it a little bit easier, but you can just go in and change, you can add labels, or you can make a uniform style, and that's what I've done. So it turns it red, and just to demonstrate, because we want to see the contour of the station that we're going to be adding in a second, you can go in and change the color and the transparency. So just for ease, I just make it completely transparent. And then we will add our contour layer of the station that we'll be using, which is in, I believe it's in, Rapid City, South Dakota. That's an MSA. So I've already downloaded the contour KML file from the FCC website, and this is an Asian-owned station from 2013's ownership report.
But again, that address you got it from was returned by that earlier query where we added the KML file links to the,
Yes.
yeah, so.
It's a little quicker. And you can edit all of these layers as well, so I can, well, if it didn't go away, you can click on the layer names and you can change them. So if you look at the map that I handed out, the MSA boundaries, I was able to change the file name that was originally downloaded from Census just to say MSA boundaries. So it kind of gives, it's a quick legend on the side of your map if you choose to print it or to share it with others. So I'm going to zoom in on our contour that was overlaid on the base map. And you can see that the map gives you the exact location of the station, and it's right, Rapid City is right here. This is our station, and then this is the contour of the station as was pulled earlier. And it's just overlaid on top of the MSA boundary for Rapid City. And again, you can change the coloring, so you can change the shape that identifies where the station's located, the color. You can add the name, so I added the name of the station, so it pops up right there. And it'll also show you the name of the contour, which is below. And you can change all these colors to however you want to. And one of the interesting things is also if you click on the layer and you can, if I click on this layer, you can see some of the other information that's associated with it. So it's a really powerful tool. So this is the Spearfish South Dakota MSA. And this is just some of the information that's attributed to it. So, and I mean, I can walk, if we want, I can walk through how to change the names of the boundaries, but I don't know if that's something that we're interested in showing. Okay, so that's just a quick way of kind of looking at and creating data visualizations with the data.
And I think, again, these specific examples are great and useful, but the bigger picture is what's really important, especially with sort of these pieces of GIS software, because they're pretty powerful, and if you can feed them data, they can create some pretty good visualizations for you pretty quickly. And we just, we created this data by just a very simple census query, and some of the data we queried by just reformatting data we already had based on what the GIS software expected to see. And, you get pretty good visuals pretty quickly. And, another thing where the sky's the limit, and you can figure it out what are you interested in, and I think you can probably find a way to show it. So I think that was where we were ending this workshop. Do we have any questions, comments? Please.
Is there a limit on how many contours you can pull up in that map?
You can pull up as many as you'd like. So you can add as many stations as you want. That's what's great about the Google Maps is that there's sometimes in the GIS software there's a number of only a certain number of layers you can add to your map, but because it's run through Google, it's really, you can add as many as you want. And you can change the names, you can change how they look. For instance, this is a blue boundary, but if you had stations that, as I mentioned, this is Asian owned, if you had like Native American owned stations, you could make the contours green, so it's a really interesting illustrative tool.
I did have one other question from earlier today. When you concentrated on the ownership of commercial stations, would it be possible to use similar queries for the non-commercial station, or is that information not available in similar format?
The information for non-commercial stations is collected on Form 323E, and that state. Remember how we talked about 2009? We made the form. That form has not been done. That again is touching on an open proceeding, so we can't say much about it. But the short answer to your question is that data is not in the tables in the same way. Anything else? Well, I hope you enjoyed. Thank you for coming. Thank you. We enjoyed it. Thanks.